This video is sponsored by Squarespace, the all-in-one website platform. More on them later.
And now, the stars of Four Kids will sing the national anthem.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn?
There are many types of bad history. Some erase the existence of entire groups of indigenous peoples. Others brush over the repressive acts of governments one finds ideologically compelling. But generally, false historical narratives spread in popularity because they speak to the individual experiences of the people who spread them. That and propaganda. There is no better example of this to me than a recent narrative about Japanese history that has become seemingly more and more popular on social media in recent years. It goes a little something like this. Japan did a lot of evil stuff, but because of anime and sushi and Hello Kitty, nobody seems to know or care. They're all too distracted. Successful rebrand complete. This is usually compared unfavorably to Germany. When you think of Germany, you think of Nazis, am I right? But when you think of Japan, you don't think of the Empire of Japan. Am I right? Here's an example of what I'm talking about, though content warning, it's Reed Choi.
Japan? How did you get the world to forget all your war crimes? Oh, you just have to distract them. Like, for example, we're really cute, we use anime, some pixelated stuff. That's exactly what we've been doing with our excellent German engineering and our automobiles. No, because cars still use gas, and you know Germany and gas, not the best connection. Maybe something a little more innocent, like food.
Anyway, I have several problems with this narrative, one of which being that the way we talk about Germany is quite weird. It's as if we think of Nazism as this brutality completely unique to this quirky Germanic culture, and something not at all connected to other genocidal regimes throughout the age of colonialism, including what Belgium did in the Congo and what the US did to indigenous peoples in the Americas, something that the Nazis literally emulated in their race policies. That's a subject for another time, though. So this narrative, when you think about it, it's compelling in that individual experience way. Maybe when you and I think of Japan, you might think of super fast railway systems, or you might think of Naruto, not necessarily Unit 731. But does that mean that it's because the Japanese government pushed this image on us and convinced the rest of the world to look past its insidious nature? Is that really part of some ingenious propaganda scheme, or are we just uneducated? The age of nation states makes us more easily convinced of the prospect of a country being like a guy. You know, Germany is like one person. They did a thing, then they did another thing. Japan is not one person. Japan is not one singular brain that all people of Japanese descent around the world have been connected to. You know, some people make sushi, some people are war crime denialists, some sushi makers deny war crimes. It seems like for us in the West, when it comes to far-off, exoticized nations like Japan, they can either be fascist or make cool stuff. And yet to us, it would be kind of bizarre to hear someone from Japan say, the US distracts us with Beyonce and milkshakes to cover up the fact that they commit acts of genocide. At the same time, there is a connection between a country's cultural creations and its international reputation, and of course then its government. This has been most recently articulated by the phrase soft power, coined by Joseph Nye in the late 80s to describe when one country gets other countries to want what it wants. Soft power is cooptive instead of coercive. It contrasts with the hard or command power of ordering others to do what it wants. So this idea that Japan uses anime and other cultural products to propagandize international audiences was recently put forth by YouTuber Moon Channel in a video called Kawaii, Anime, Propaganda, and Soft Power Politics. It suggests that these popular cultural products work as a type of propaganda that coaxes people in other countries into loving Japan and overlooking its country's often violent xenophobia and conservatism and the atrocities it committed in the early 20th century. So, spoiler alert, I don't think this narrative is quite correct, and I also have a lot of issues with this video, but I'm going to save that conversation for the conclusion, so if you just want spicy video essayist on video essayist drama, you might just want to skip there. I think though that the first question that one should ask when this narrative is put forth is, who doesn't know? Who doesn't know that Japan committed war crimes? Chinese people know. Koreans know. Southeast Asians from Burma to the Philippines to Indonesia know what Japan did. Hell, even Reed Choi knows, and that guy doesn't know anything. It seems like Westerners find out facts about the rest of the world and go, oh my god, nobody knows about this. No, you didn't know about this. And then the real question is, why don't Americans and Europeans know what the Japanese did in World War II? Why don't they know about Japanese politics today? Why do many of us only think of Japan in terms of its enjoyable cultural exports? I went to school for journalism, and I used to be a professional journalist who would write often about music and culture, but I no longer do that because now I do YouTube, and sometimes I miss it. Sometimes I miss the feeling of writing things down and publishing it on a page. That's where Squarespace comes in. Lately, I've been doing a private blog project where I write about artists like Mike, this great rapper that I'm really into, and I use Squarespace's software, which I've always been really curious about, and I've had a great experience. I think the thing that really stands out about Squarespace is its design tools. It's a really easy to use design interface. You can use all these really beautiful templates or customize your website to a really strong degree using all these different tools, color schemes, font stuff, etc. Squarespace is also a good place to upload videos, video content, video libraries that could potentially work as a resume or just a different place where you want to upload a video-based project. So if you're interested in starting your own website, maybe something you could sell merch through, maybe something that you could use to raise donations for a particular project, consider using Squarespace. Check out squarespace.com/ELLIOTSANG to save 10% off of your first purchase of a website or domain. Thanks to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. Now let's get back to it. Folks, history is hard. I've read different texts for this video, but the book I've probably cited the most here is The Modern History of Japan by Andrew Gordon, which I hear good things about. It's pretty acclaimed as a succinct explainer of history in Japan from the 19th century to basically now. Of course, though, when it comes to history, there is not always this very easy, factual, obvious explanation for everything. In fact, usually there are many different conflicting theories and ideas that we will see come in opposition with each other when it comes to reading things that have happened. So please bear that in mind. And bear in mind also, we're talking about Japanese history here. And I am not Japanese. I know y'all think people who are vaguely Asian all come from the same place. I am not Japanese. I am a quarter Chinese, and I cannot read Japanese. So I'm reading some pretty great English language texts, but please bear that in mind. I only point this out because a lazy approach to history of other countries is how we get bad narratives about history in the first place. Okay, disclaimer over. So, the West has been generally fascinated by Japan, especially since it's opening up to the rest of the world in the mid-19th century. One of the things that people have been the most fascinated about is how quickly and dramatically it modernized and changed in the late 19th century to adapt to the rise of capitalism. One noted British admiral, One noted British admiral was quoted in 1895 as saying, "Japan has within 40 years gone through the various administrative phases that occupied England about 800 years and Rome about 600, and I am loath to say that anything is impossible with her." Beatrice Webb, a famed member of the Fabian Society, which is like a predecessor of today's Labour Party in the UK, the left-leaning party, said once that the Chinese were a horrid race. But the Japanese, shame our administrative capacity, shame our inventiveness, shame our leadership. Historically not hard to shame British leadership, to be honest. The process by which Japan made these changes is called the Meiji Restoration. It's named after Emperor Meiji, who became the first emperor in centuries to have political authority over Japan. You see, since basically the 1100s, shogunates, or military governments run by clans of warriors, had rendered the authority of the emperor essentially obsolete in comparison. The Tokugawa shogunate, which ruled from 1603 to 1868, is known now for being highly restrictive of interaction with the outside world. But Gordon notes that this was not always the case. It was a decision made by Tokugawa leadership to resist the influence of Europe. Because, that time period, Europe was up to a lot of funny business, as well as to resist the outside influence of China. Now, there is some debate about how much Tokugawa leadership wanted to open up trade with China or change relations with China. There's a good paper on it that I'll show on screen here. Really, though, we'll get to that later in this video, a lot later. By the late 1700s, elites and elite adjacent of Japanese society had generally developed a fierce opposition to cooperating with the West. Within a few decades, they would be forced to change their stance.
Taylor, there is nothing in there that concerns you. If you love me, you'll let it go.
Fine.
Thank you.
So, the Industrial Revolution and general age of revolutions going on in Europe and later in the United States had left Japan in the dust and in the dark compared to leading Western nation states. As Gordon writes, in comparison, the Tokugawa polity was a clumsy and divided structure. It was incapable of taxing the economic resources of the entire country or of mobilizing human resources throughout the land, and it could not sustain a monopoly on the conduct of international relations. By 1853, internal unrest from the changing roles of farmers and samurai, and several devastating famines, and defiance of social norms became the ground-up rock that Western imperialism soaked in nitroglycerin. After years of explorations in and around Japan from several Western nation states, the Americans, known for their subtlety, kicked open the shoji and said, "What's up?" Gordon writes, Commodore Matthew Perry of the United States arrived in Japan as the most determined carrier yet of this simple message: agree to trade in peace or suffer the consequences in war. The Japanese tried to impress him and his explorers during a return visit by showcasing their sumo wrestling traditions. It didn't work. One described in his diary an event of shoving, yelling, tugging, hauling, bawling, twisting, and curveting about, with seemingly no aim whatever. He concluded, it was a very unsatisfactory trial of strength. There were one or two falls, but after all, any wrestler that I have heretofore seen of half the muscle would have laughed at them. On the other hand, the Americans brought some of their latest technology, including a 1/4 scale locomotive engine and a 370-foot circle of track. Steam was up, an engineer got on the tender, and one of the Bakufu commissioners sat on the car. It was set going and ran round at a speed of 18 miles an hour. The Japanese official, his robe flapping in the wind, was reported to be delighted at the ride. The ride from then on was less enjoyable. Japanese officials were forced to sign the Convention of Kanagawa in 1854, allowing the U.S. to trade freely at two ports, the first in a series of unequal treaties with European powers that left the nation embarrassed and rapidly weakening. Let's go back to the myths of Japan for a second. In the West, we have this conception of Japan as having a sense of pride in itself as an idea. But long before legacies of Bushido and Kamikaze had popularized in the West to describe soldiers' fealty to the state, long before the nation's neoliberal soft power endeavors, Japanese nationalism starts here, in humiliation, in subordination to Western empires, in a response to colonization. Gordon writes, it would be misleading to conclude simply that these treaties trampled a pre-existing national pride and sovereignty. Rather, from the early 1800s through the 1860s, the very process of dealing with the pushy barbarians created modern Japanese nationalism. Among shogunal officials, in daimyo castles, and in the private academies where politically concerned samurai debated history and policy, a new conception took hold of Japan as a single nation, to be defended and governed as such. Let me make sure before I go forward that you don't get the impression that I'm excusing Japan, like I'm parroting nationalist narratives, like I think Japan is some sort of protagonist that was simply bullied by the rest of the world until it committed war crimes as a trauma response. I'm just trying to make the linkages here, which were key in the rise of colonialism everywhere, and it's important that we don't victimize as we try to understand. Okay, so Ezra Vogel in the book China and Japan Facing History, which I'll touch on more later, asserts that Japan's response to Matthew Perry and the ominous specter of Europe was to modernize as quickly as possible. Adaptation would be necessary to not only survive, but to thrive in this new era. The first American consul general assigned to Japan, Townsend Harris, arrived in Japan in August 1856. Though it had been centuries since Japan sent missions abroad, 3 months after Harris's arrival, a shogun official told him, "The time will soon come when we will build ships like yours, and then we can visit the United States in a proper manner." The boys were already plotting. In late 1857, a high shogun official, Hotta Masayoshi, wrote that Japan's policy should be to conclude friendly alliances, to send ships to foreign countries everywhere and conduct trade, to copy the foreigners where they are at their best, and so repair our own shortcomings to foster our national strength. A quick note on this Townsend Harris, by the way, total slimeball. When the US send people to other countries, they're not sending their best, you know? He had nasty things to say about the Japanese, and of course, even nastier things to do to them. This is from the wonderfully titled "The Whites Are Enemies of Heaven: Climate Caucasianism and Asian Ecological Protection" by Dr. Mark W. Driscoll. Harris thought that constantly browbeating the Tokugawa officials was necessary because, as he wrote in his journal, he knew the Eastern character from 5 years doing business in China. It was unreliable, devious, and foreclosed from the truth. But the Japanese were even more mendacious than their Chinese neighbors. They are the greatest liars on earth. As was often the case, this imputation of mendacity was a smokescreen for Euro-white license and disavowal of Harris's own behavior. Quick note from me. What he's saying is every accusation is a confession. In clear violation of the Perry agreements, Harris attempted twice to sell expensive American weapons to the Tokugawa negotiators under the table. Later, he took advantage of the Shimoda governor's inexperience with exchange rates and swindled the Japanese by paying for his annual expenses from 1857 with silver dollars, but lying in his reimbursement claims that he had actually used the same number of gold dollars. Silver dollars were 1/3 the value of gold in Japan's currency exchange at the time. We've got ourselves a proto-crypto scammer. The CoffeeZilla of the time would have been eaten off of videos about this. But what qualified Harris himself for the greatest liar on earth award was his approach to Japan's culture of non-Christian eroticism. Frequently deriding Japanese people's lubricity in his journal, he ridiculed what he called Japanese officials' adolescent obsession with white women's body parts. However, Harris accompanied his translator Henry Hueskin on his regular voyeuristic sojourns to the local public baths on at least one occasion. Hueskin's peeping Tom angered the local women so much that they altered their regular bathing times to avoid his creepy ogling. Basically, he was Deshaun Watson before Deshaun Watson. When Hueskin adjusted in turn, one fed-up woman sent her boyfriend to threaten him. Finally, at the beginning of June 1857, the Japanese were startled by an extra demand from Harris just when the negotiations seemed to be wrapping up. Attractive teenage servants provided to both him and Hueskin. In fact, Harris threatened to withdraw the entirety of the U.S. agreement if the girls weren't supplied immediately, risking imminent war. Bro was about to start a whole war because he wanted to be a freaky McNasty. So 1 week later, a reluctant 17-year-old named Tojin Okichi was forced to have sex with the obese and hirsute Harris. But even this wasn't enough, as he threw her out 3 days later after discovering a skin eruption on her back that repulsed him. Although he had sex with Okichi again, behind the scenes, Gorge Us Harris demanded cleaner girls. It took 6 months for the Japanese officials to locate young women whose parents would agree to this arrangement. But they eventually did provide him with 2 new teenagers in the spring and summer of 1858. You know, international politics, they're really fun to talk about. I think the story of Townsend Harris speaks a lot to the history of the Western approach to Japan. After the US forced Japan to open up to foreign trade in 1858, Japanese art became all the rage in Europe. Its culture, art, and people were always the subject of great intrigue there. For example, Japanese porcelain was often commodified as a luxury good, something very rare and hard to get your hands on during that Tokugawa period. Now Japan was open, and it was open season. But Orientalism works 2 ways. It can seem positive in the way of fascination and desire for contact, or negative in the way that Harris was doing it. But either way, it's based on the same principle, a coveting of people and resources from a far-off country. Needless to say, the mood in Japan was one of humiliation and fear. The country needed to change, and those who could position themselves as leaders of the new guard would be guaranteed elite status and money. And as we know historically, whenever situations like that happen, it usually resolves itself in a very peaceful way, and only the chillest and most thoughtful dudes end up on top. Of course, conventional wisdom became that Japan would need a strong, ambitious empire to compete with those rapidly diminishing its agency. The Boshin War, also known as the Japanese Civil War, broke out across 1868 and 1869, with several insurgents toppling the Tokugawa shogunate in the name of the imperial court. Their task was simple and syncretistic. We're going to centralize the Japanese government the way that these Western nations centralized into nation states, but we will do so by returning power to the emperor instead of to the shogunates, which will also give that sense of Japanese traditionalism, as well as give us the new hotshots of the leadership something that we can appeal to say, you know, we're in service of the emperor, we're in service of the empire, creating a new empire in a sense that we will be in charge of this time. The organization of land completely changed. Domains were abolished, and Japan would be separated into newly constructed prefectures that would be controlled by the central government. There's an idea, folks, in part purported by ultranationalists like Yukio Mishima, we've got a video about him you should check out, that Japan's fierceness and loyalty in battle was among the traditional, long-standing characteristics of its society that was modernized and even lost to some degree during the Meiji Restoration. The reality is not really that, and it's not really that simple, obviously. Yes, samurai were fiercely loyal to their feudal lords. The lords owned them. They owned their property. Now that feudalism was over and samurai were abolished, who was there to be loyal to now? For the Meiji government, it was key that citizenry be loyal to the state. That was how Europeans had revolutionized their militaries at the end of the 18th century. Before, you had a small military class, aristocrats who trained in battle their whole lives, who fought wars on behalf of the lords and the empires, monarchies ahead of them. But now you had a whole population in an area guaranteed rights by elites in the name of a nation, and they were now motivated to all stand up to protect it, to defend it. Gordon writes that a patriotic spirit that could induce willing military service, a key element of modern nationalism, had to be drummed into the masses of people over several decades. Part of this was instrumentalized through compulsory education and conscription. Workers would also contribute to a new narrative of national success while building up domestic industries, such as shipyards and coal mines. Indeed, as the world had entered its capitalist era, Japan would have to become capitalist in order to gain power. Distinctively, it made use of zaibatsu, or monopoly conglomerates, who either had merchant ties from the Tokugawa era or had been at the forefront of organizing new industry in the Meiji era. Zaibatsu were power players that employed the politics of business and development to become wealthy and powerful, something that never happens in any other parts of the world. Gordon uses the case of the Mitsui family as an example. The Mitsui family, for example, had been dry goods retailers in Kyoto and Edo since the 1670s. They had been moneylenders to the shogunate through the end of its days. In the 1860s, Mitsui's general manager cultivated ties to anti-shogunal forces as well. The family built on these ties after 1868. It handled a portion of the new government's tax collection operations, and from this founded the Mitsui Bank in 1876. The same year, it founded a general trading company. Soon thereafter, Ito Hirobumi, the Minister of Public Works at the time, offered Mitsui Trading Company an exclusive contract for sale of coal from the government's Miike mine. As Ito neatly put it, "We will not be tight. You can acquire the coal at cost price and get started on it directly." Mitsui made immense profits from this arrangement. In 1888, it bought the mine outright, although it paid a handsome price to the government. It also sold much of this coal to British steamers, and these contacts helped Mitsui Trading open branch offices in Shanghai, Hong Kong, and then London. In the following decade, Mitsui built on this base and used its profits to acquire or found engineering, cotton spinning, and paper pulp companies, and numerous other firms. Other examples of zaibatsu include Mitsubishi, Toyota, and Kawasaki, as well as less internationally known staples of Japanese business like Sumitomo, the origin of today's Sumitomo Mitsui Banking Corporation. Now, of course, with power players building massive, profitable entities and extraordinary wealth in short periods of time, this gave way to massive income inequality. And given the comparative lack of training and other factors among workers, their productivity compared to the West had lagged behind, according to Gordon, which exacerbated the need of any capitalist economy. Cheap labor. All right. Time for things to get really fun. In the early Meiji period, Japan sent a group of scholars and statesmen to Europe with aims of building recognition for the new government, as well as to study the way that Western political economies worked. You know, the ones that were on top of the world at this point. Their conclusion? We gotta kill more people, y'all. We are not killing enough people. We are not colonizing hard enough. In order to do that, you had to build a strong military, developed rapidly by getting as many people in your country as possible to enlist and to produce state-of-the-art technology for the military. So, from the Meiji Restoration onward, the Japanese government had a clear impetus to build national pride and unity in order to rapidly achieve its economic and militaristic objectives. This included becoming capitalist and modernizing the military, but it also involved a cultural project. Education and music were two realms in which Japan saw the need to adjust to the West expeditiously. Gordon writes, beginning in the 1870s, government officials, educators, and artists began to explore what it might mean to westernize the entire spectrum of cultural life. This sometimes took place in a force-fed spirit of whole package modernization. Organizers of the Japanese military, for example, decided in 1871 that if Western armies all had military bands, and if Japan was to remake its military on Western lines, then Japanese forces had best follow suit. They quickly established a new, enduring tradition of Western-style military music. In a similar fashion, in 1880, the Meiji government engaged a Boston public school teacher to bring proper modern music education into the new Japanese schools. He helped prepare the first school children's songbook in 1881. Half the tunes were Western melodies with new lyrics by Japanese poets. Auld Lang Syne became a syrupy ballad about the light of fireflies. Other songs were older Japanese melodies rearranged into Western-style harmonies. Simultaneously, Japan needed to convince its people that it wasn't just capitulating or changing to become more Western or to just suit the tastes of the West, but in fact merging the power of Westernization with an increasingly embraced idea of Japan as a unified nation with proud traditions. Beginning in the mid-1880s, a drive to preserve or revive a so-called traditional Japanese culture emerged in a mood of confrontation with Western-oriented reformers. Leaders included both Westerners and Japanese. Modern martial arts such as judo, sports such as sumo wrestling, and arts such as the cultivation of bonsai plants were both transformed in practice and took on symbolic meaning as emblems of Japaneseness for the first time. Religion was also crucial. The leaders of Japan saw to it that scattered religious traditions most closely associated with the emperor, namely the worship of supernatural deities called kami, expel Buddhist influence and now become a unified, strictly imposed religion called Shinto, which each citizen was to follow and which included the view, or at least the respect, that the emperor was supernatural in his own right. The government set up a department of Shinto in 1868. In 1870, it issued a proclamation stating that the nation was to be guided by the way of the kami, Shinto deities. In 1871, Shinto shrines were officially designated as government institutions for the observance of national rights. The notion that Shinto was the ancient religion of all Japanese was invented by the modern state builders of Meiji times, as were the institutions to promote this idea. This is funny to me because there's a lot of talk, always when it comes to Japan, about Japan being this ancient, traditional civilization with these strongly held beliefs that are extremely based in the nation as a whole. Not just strong traditions that are localized to certain regions, but all just a sense of Japanese-ness. But that was a notion created during the time period of Imperial Japan. So keep that in mind next time you see people downplay the potential offensiveness of the rising sun flag as simply part of a long-standing tradition. And this is really important when it comes to the narrative of like, oh, Japan convinced us that it's great because of anime and hid all of the bad stuff it did. The roots of Japanese culture industries, whether they be in traditional practices like judo or in hybridized practices like music, were not based on convincing the rest of the world to love Japan, but on convincing the Japanese to love Japan, enough to die for it. We'll go over this later, but the West craved Japanese art before the opening, long before the Meiji Restoration, and not because Japan advertised itself to them, clearly, but because it was exclusive. It was from a distant, far-off land where people do different things differently. So Japan is becoming nationalist, and all this stuff is part of that project. But maybe the most important part of Japan's ability to grow as a nation would be its ability to expand its territory and resources. This is, after all, what defines empires and businesses. You see, if you look at a map of Japan, you might think this is what it's always looked like, and that's not exactly true. There is such a thing as mainland Japan, and then there are prefectures of Japan that were islands on its outskirts. This started from imperialism. In 1869, Japan forcefully incorporated the island of Hokkaido. In 1874, Japan unsuccessfully invaded Taiwan. In 1879, Japan conquered the Ryukyu Kingdom and incorporated the state of Okinawa. These were the beginnings of Japan's colonialist policy towards the rest of Asia. The consequences have been dire. Hokkaido is an island off the coast of northern mainland Japan. Historically known by different names, most famously Ezo, the island has been inhabited by the indigenous Ainu peoples. Anime fans might know the Ainu as partial inspiration for the Ishvalan peoples in Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood. According to Pia M. Jolliffe, the dominant narrative of Hokkaido has been a familiar one in popular histories of decolonization. You know, there was nobody there, so we just took it for the empire. It was a win-win deal, you know? It was a land without a people for a people that needed land. The Japanese intellectual Komori Yoichi even calls the Meiji government's development plan for Hokkaido an invasion in the name of development. He emphasizes that Ainu Moshir, the Ainu term for Ezo, was categorized as a no man's land and consequently claimed as Japanese territory. This is erasure, plain and simple. For one, Ezo had been in a kind of colonization push-pull scenario with Japanese leaders dating back several centuries. Jolliffe notes that in the 4th and 5th centuries, the Yamato state was already concerned about the management of areas in the northeast. They referred to the Ainu as emishi, which referred to crude and unrefined people who resisted Yamato control and who opposed the socio-cultural and political economic practices of the Japanese elite. In the 15th and 16th centuries, trade was ongoing between Japan and Ezo, but with unfavorable conditions, of course, for the Ainu. There's a passage here from an Ainu writer who describes how in 1858 his grandfather had to work as a slave under the Basho Seido, which is basically what they call the system of trade that they had organized. And basically the village head tried to prevent the Japanese samurai from taking a young boy away, his grandfather, but the Japanese rejected Inisetet's supplication, stating that even a child was capable of carrying one salmon on his back. So yeah, there were definitely people there. They were just people that were convenient, people that could be used for labor, people that could be exploited because they were seen as subhuman. So there you go. The system that Japan held over Ezo included systematized rape and concubinage of Ainu women, as well as, unsurprisingly, odious prejudice. Many Japanese settlers regarded the Ainu as inhuman and the inferior descendants of dogs. So this is before Japan goes colonial. In the 19th century, with fears of Russians expanding into Ezo and the necessity for war, this oppression turned into forced assimilation, with the Meiji Restoration certifying that project by annexing Ezo in 1869 and renaming it Hokkaido. And that begat the forced displacement of many Ainu and the forcing of many laborers to work in Hokkaido to build a labor force independent of the indigenous group. A lot of the people who worked in Hokkaido were slaves, essentially. Prisoners who were sent to Hokkaido to do agriculture and mining work. They had a coal mine there, the Horonai coal mine, which became the 3rd most productive in Japan. And because prison labor was grotesquely cheap, it helped the Mitsui company sell the coal cheaper than anyone else on the Asian market. Today, Mitsui is still a popular energy and trading company in Japan. So that's where it started, with forced labor, coal mining in Hokkaido that built huge profits for early Japanese companies. Now, where else could the Japanese Empire expand? You know what, let's save Okinawa for later. Japan and China, where to begin? Japan and China have had a really long and complicated historical relationship. China's empire, beginning as a cradle of civilization and extending through thousands of years of political dominance, was the center of East Asia, which other Asian kingdoms fed economically in a subordinate relationship. But Japan has always been the most resistant to this order, and their separation via the seas of Japan and East China allowed them to avoid the brunt of military expeditions. Basically, because Japan was situated in an area that was difficult to get to, it was hard to send a lot of force there. Regardless, the dynamic, to simplify as much as possible, has long been one of Japan being a little brother of China. Never was this more apparent than after the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, when the long prosperous Chinese empire faced its humiliating century of collapse. So, like in Japan, China fell apart. Its empire, the Qing dynasty, fell apart at the hands of European imperialism and the rise of capitalism. China got bullied by the British during the Opium Wars, long story, and their 2-century-long imperial dynasty collapsed also with popular dissent and loss of international power. So, remember I mentioned the China and Japan book by Ezra Vogel? We're going to go back to that. In that book, Vogel puts forth a narrative popular among historians from both nations. Where Japan was quick in studying the West and modernizing, China was held back by its massive disorganized territory and also arrogance. So he cites, for instance, that it was easier, quote, to get a unified national response in a compact territory of 4 small islands, and the sea transportation available at the time made it relatively easy to establish communications and transportation links among all parts of Japan. In China, until the 1880s, when the first telegraph wires were laid, it took nearly a month for government communications to travel from one end of the country to the other. Living on a small group of islands, the Japanese had long felt more vulnerable to dangers from across the sea than the Chinese had. That sense of danger had made them eager to acquire more information from abroad. Chinese leaders had long worried about possible invaders by land, coming by horseback from the north, and they were less concerned about learning about the world across the seas. Early in the 19th century, even before the Meiji Restoration, the shogun in Edo began sending missions abroad to learn from other countries how to modernize, just as the Japanese had done by sending missions to China in the 7th and 8th centuries. Chinese leaders, and this is important, confident of the greatness of their rich civilization, were never eager to learn from other countries. Now, if you ask me, this narrative is almost too convenient, but it also makes a lot of sense, and it's something that I'll put forth here, with the caveat that I'm open to hearing other interpretations of what the Chinese attitude was and how much it played a part in this change. So, Japan's going to expand. Where are you expanding to? The places you're expanding to, they're also places that China has dominion over, namely the Ryukyu Islands, or today's Okinawa Prefecture. So we kind of know who won that war in the long run, but how? How did that come about? So notice that the Ryukyu Islands are strategically placed in between parts of Japan, China, Russia, and different Southeast Asian countries. There was a kingdom that ruled there, and the way that it worked was that Japan essentially owned the land of that separate kingdom, but China essentially owned it economically. It was a tributary state of China. Now, after the Meiji Restoration, Japan's like, we're going to be an empire, so enough sharing this. This is going to be our land. We're claiming this as one of our domains, or Han, as they were called. China didn't have much of a response to this, but then, furthermore, after indigenous Paiwan people in Taiwan killed over 50 shipwrecked Ryukyuan Japanese sailors, Japan sent what we would call a punitive expedition to Taiwan that led to China officially abdicating the Ryukyu Islands altogether to the Japanese. So, something happens in Taiwan, a bunch of Ryukyuan Japanese people get killed. Japan is like, hey, China, you own Taiwan, that's not good. Don't let that happen. You know what? We're coming over there. And China was like, all right, you're not getting Taiwan, but take Okinawa. Now, with these situations continuing to escalate, China and Japan realized that they needed to be prepared for potential battle with each other. Or at the very least, Japan did. Japan took that seriously, especially after the two clashed over Korea, namely in the 1882 Imo incident, which was caused by unrest in Korea over how it would modernize and essentially whether it would side more with Chinese or Japanese empire in its modernization. At that time, when that incident broke out, China won the battle. And this made Japan really pay attention to their military. It basically woke them up, you could say, to the fact that if they were going to continue this expansionist work, they were going to need to really invest a lot into their military. And so Vogel writes that the military budget quickly grew to represent more than 20% of the entire Japanese government's budget. Uh-oh, this is where shit gets bad. 2 years after the Imo incident, China and Japan were clashing in Korea again. Japan kind of facilitated a coup d'etat in Korea with aims at bringing Korea further into Japanese sphere of influence and Meiji-style modernization. Although it's controversial just kind of what role Japan played. So there's a guy named Kim Ok-yeon, okay? He grew up poor and he had education to become part of the aristocracy, and as he did that, he trained under Japanese imperial educators and scholars who essentially brought him to becoming very influenced by what was going on in Japan and made him be like, Korea gotta do this. Remember that at this time, Korea is a tributary of China. They're very beholden to the whims of China, and China is not doing very well. And when kingdoms don't do very well, their tributary states kind of take a hit, not only economically, but also in terms of how much force kind of is used within those tributary states, especially when those tributary states are looking for their independence, which was becoming a more and more common theme within Korea. So Kim Ok-yeon is like, you know what, guys, let's put together a little party with some folks that I know and some of the Japanese like emissary folks that are over here, and we're just gonna overthrow the Korean monarchy. You know, we're just gonna do that. It happened in Japan, so of course we could do it over here, right? All right, we'll meet you over in Hanyang. Let's go. Oh shit, we got our asses kicked. What happened? Vogel writes that this situation was another humiliating defeat for Japan, after which Japanese intellectuals, who had long had love for China, and you have to know that Japanese scholars at this time were often going to China and studying under the long Chinese traditions of literature and religion, etc., at that time became critical of Chinese culture because it was slow in adapting to the needs of modern society. And so more and more scholars are starting to be like, maybe we should leave China behind. Meanwhile, China just beat Japan and Korea essentially twice, leaving them even less incentivized to take Japanese military force seriously. But they were like, you know what, we want to avoid Japanese aggression. We want to keep little bro in his place, make sure he doesn't feel like acting up again. So we're just going to send one of our big ass ships over to Japan. We're going to send them this big ass ship that's decked out with new military technology, and they're going to see that and they're going to be like, oh shit, we can't fight these guys. They're too cool. So that's what they did. Remember that part of the reason that China is not taking Japan particularly seriously is because they have more concerns about European nations, especially Russia, Britain, etc. So they chose to flex on Japan and hopefully make them pipe down, but that was not a good idea. Vogel writes, after seeing the Dingyuan, which was the name of the ship, one of the ships, the Japanese government decided to construct 3 large cruisers, each with firepower comparable to that of the Dingyuan. After 1889, although China continued to invest in the Summer Palace, including the reconstruction of its large marble boat pavilion, there were no new significant investments in Navy ships. In contrast, in Japan after 1893, in addition to imperial contributions to the Navy, 1/10 of the salaries of civil officials and military officers was deducted and added to the funding allocated for the construction of naval ships and the purchase of arms. Guys, the situation is escalating. Even though Japan was getting more and more active militarily, China still wasn't taking them seriously. Japan was also sending regular expeditions to China, although not with obvious intentions to go to war, of course. Vogel writes that even in 1894, when China and Japan would eventually go to war for the first time, China's ambassador in Tokyo, Wang Fengtao, reported to Beijing that the Japanese were so beset with internal squabbling that they were unlikely to be active externally. Whoops. It gets worse, honestly. Vogel also notes the work of historian Samuel Chu, who found after extensive research that high officials in Beijing were far more occupied with plans for the Empress Dowager's 60th birthday celebration than with plans to pursue the war. Even after the war began, many officials were mostly concerned about whether the Western powers would enter the war, and they did not consider Japan to be important enough to worry about. Whoops. Folks, this is why we do cancel culture, okay? Take fascism seriously. The war began after, surprise, surprise, another rebellion in Korea. This time by peasants who were suffering repression and economic turmoil as Korea clumsily attempted to modernize. The Korean government did not have the military power to handle this uprising of peasants, and so they called China and were like, can you send in troops? China sent troops in to Korea without notifying Japan first, which was the rule that they were supposed to follow, and it's said that that's what started the Sino-Japanese War. That, of course, is a very convenient explanation for it. Obviously, you can see that there are far more tensions and larger economic stakes at play, with which Japan as an empire could look at the situation and be like, any small indiscretion that China makes is the straw that breaks the camel's back here. Now, as Vogel writes, the Chinese public, Chinese officials, and Western observers overwhelmingly believed that if war were to break out, China could easily defeat Japan. But as observed by key diplomat Li Hongzhang and General Yuan Shikai, Japan was not the Japan of old. They had spent decades studying Chinese geography, infrastructure, and military, and Western military, geography, economics, and they'd been pouring a ton of their budget into rapid military development. They also had high levels of coordination across their smaller terrain, which the Chinese didn't have. China couldn't even get all of their troops to fight in this war. Its Southern Fleet did not participate in the First Sino-Japanese War. Its military regiments all spoke different dialects and languages because, remember, that's a thing in China historically. So communication was terrible. As Vogel put it, Japanese troops were better trained, more disciplined, and better organized. Disciplined to a point anyway. There was a massacre at Port Arthur in China that was a sign of things to come in terms of Japanese military getting overzealous and committing war crimes. Prior to that, honestly, Japan had had a reputation for not doing that kind of stuff. So again, bad signs. But this is the thing. In multiple ways here, the Empire of Japan was shocking the world. And after winning the First Sino-Japanese War, the order in Asia was completely changed. Japan forced China into an unequal treaty, the Treaty of Shimonoseki, ceding to Japan numerous territories, but most notably Taiwan. Another of the territories that was promised by China to Japan was the Liaodong Peninsula. But interesting, ministers of Russia, Germany, and France quickly reached out to Japan with friendly advice, as Vogel describes. They told Japan basically, you know, if you take this peninsula, it's pretty close to Beijing, right? That's like the capital, and that could cause a lot of aggravation and further kind of violence in the area, and you guys wouldn't want that, right? Because then, potentially, it might turn into an international conflict. And then you might have to go to war with a lot of different countries. And you wouldn't want that, right? So this was a threat, okay? This is a threat. As Vogel writes, it was clear to the Japanese that if they did not follow this friendly advice, the foreign powers were prepared to use force to intervene. And they knew that the Japanese military was no match for the combined Western forces. So Japan was not happy about that, but they were happy about getting Taiwan, which they rapidly modernized and developed into a key colony for the Japanese economy, especially in the agricultural realm. They also developed a strong public health system and education system in Taiwan. Stuff that, you know, even to this day, certain Taiwanese politicians and people will generally say that their experience with Japan was a friendly one that was mutually beneficial. Japan's intention was to show that they could do colonialism just as well as any of the white boys, but it was clear to them that the white boys were not necessarily happy about this development, about them becoming more powerful. But Japan continued to develop, and, you know, we're moving pretty quickly here, but then there was the Russo-Japanese War, okay? You might know a little bit about that. Japan and Russia competed, let's say, went to war over various parts of Korea and Manchuria. And Japan won, again. This time against a massive Western nation. I mean, you're talking about one of the most, let's use sports terms, one of the biggest upsets of like military modern history. And this was such a big deal that it set the stage for 2 Russian revolutions and the birth of the Soviet Union. And thus, for both parties, set the table for World War II and the Cold War. But we're not there yet. So let's just set the stage here. Let's just do a quick temperature check of how Japan's doing right now, okay? At the time of the Meiji Restoration, Japan was like, we need to expand into new territory and develop stronger economically in different territories. So it expanded to the north and south coast off of mainland Japan. And then it got into some conflicts with China, its big brother, over some territories that both of them wanted. And then they built this huge rah-rah energy and a ton of resources for the military in Japan with the explicit purpose of, this is for our national good, this is for our economy, this is for building us into an independent nation that will no longer be bullied by China and the rest of the world. And then they kicked China's ass in war, one of the biggest military upsets in history. Everybody's going crazy. And then a few years later, they kicked Russia's ass in war. Everybody's going even crazier. Sounds pretty good, right? You know, the vibe was generally very celebratory. Here's the thing though. Let's say we separate the Japanese political realm into three separate factions, okay? You've got the civil government, the thing that they started in the Meiji Restoration, you know, the prime minister, the diet is what they call it, but basically the parliament. Then you have the military, and then you have the populace. The civil government, by its own strategy, needed the military. It relied on the military and it championed the military as the thing that would cause Japan to win, that would bring Japan prosperity. And then the military did it. And then the populace, which was convinced by the new media systems in Japan, was fully on board with the military. So these two parts of that trio are over the moon. So its civil government planned this out, and it was really happy about this, but it should have been concerned. Because what happens when you're the least important part of the trio? And it's clear to everybody more and more with time. The death of Emperor Meiji in 1912 led the civil government and empire in a bit of a crisis situation. His son, Emperor Taisho, was not him. Meiji's advisors, the Genro, which were a key part of how the Genro took responsibility for the decisions that the emperor would make, and they essentially also laid out exactly what the civil government and military would do. But the Genro was dying out. The emperor and his key advisors, who had very important control over this entire system, were dying out. So who's going to follow that up? At this point, especially now that the military have built this much power. Setbacks or unpopular decisions made by the civil government became impossible to push through as the military built more and more political power. The civil government became less and less able to push for liberal reforms, which would be necessary in order to properly settle into the territories it was acquiring, to properly organize its economy, and to keep its population happy and economically fulfilled. They couldn't really do that because doing that would require taking military budget away and moving it more and more towards other realms of the budget. And the people who were in the military didn't want that because that meant less posts for military people. And so who's going to tell them, hey, we're taking some of your budget away now that you've given us everything we've ever wanted, and you also have all the license to do whatever you want? Anyway, what's the big deal? Keep gassing up your military. You're making enough money anyway from your territories to be able to keep paying for everything, right? Once that military just gets bigger and badder because you put all the money into it, then you basically have the way paved for you to keep you safe and to continue to build with what you have. It's just going to be a little bit slower, right? It's going to be fine, right? Obviously, it's not quite that simple. The military budget was going to the soldiers, okay? It was going to the people in the military, the officers. When Japan went to war against Germany for a port in China in World War I, they won, but they took heavy casualties because military tech was rapidly upgrading. They couldn't deal with heavy artillery and air bombing. The fuck is that? Air bombing? What are they, gods now over there? But it took so many years to fix this because the civil government was becoming so weak to the demands of the military officers who were getting the budget. Hara Takashi, former Minister of Domestic Affairs, became Prime Minister in 1918 after poorly subsidized farmers revolted against the government over rice prices. He was trying to establish more diplomatic norms with the rest of the world so Japan could now build up their territories. And then in 1921, he got stabbed to death by a right-wing nationalist. The right-wing nationalist who killed Hara didn't like that Hara was trying to give women the right to vote, something that is a useful thing to incorporate into your liberal democracies, aside from moral concerns here. It's not like any of these people were moral, okay? They're politicians and military people. The right-wing nationalists also didn't like that Hara was being less friendly with the military. So what happened to that right-wing nationalist? I mean, you kill the prime minister, that's usually, right? That's the end of it. He didn't get a death sentence. He got a life sentence. And then he got out of jail 13 years later. The message was clear. far-right civilians had permission from the military and from popular mandate to do whatever they wanted. It's great to beat China's ass in war and take some of their territories, okay? But you have to establish diplomatic relations afterward, because there's a lot of work that has to be done then to build those territories up and to gain recognition of your ownership of those territories internationally. You need to at least have the promise of peace, but the military was bloodthirsty. The military knew that as long as they killed people abroad and took more territory, they would be celebrated for it in the press, and the civil government, based in the system that the Meiji government set up, no longer had Meiji and his men to rein them in. So the Japanese military became more and more aggressive towards China. The 1920s were filled with civil unrest in China, a country that was now completely divided into different governments, some territories controlled by warlords. Did I say that word funny? Warlords. Civil war breaks out in China, mainly between two parties, the Kuomintang, or the Nationalist Party, and the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party. The Kuomintang had way more resources, and they were way more favorable toward international interests. They were very much going to steer China into a similar direction as other liberal democracies, with a more conservative bend. The communists were far smaller in comparison, but they grew rapidly and maintained a stable presence because they had strong strategy, including staying in rural areas that are harder to get to with the military, and also were pretty much surrounded by poor peasant farmers that were very much on the side of the communists. And also just that populism that people really were buying into, that kind of economic populism and positive attitude of making China a more equitable place, which of course was more favorable for the people who had been screwed over by the empire. The beef was very bitter, to the point that the leader of the Kuomintang, Chiang Kai-shek, didn't want to fight the Japanese even as the Japanese military continuously encroached on Chinese territory. As Vogel writes, because his troops were limited, Chiang Kai-shek figured he had to choose between fighting the communists or fighting the Japanese. He chose the communists, saying that they were a disease of the heart, whereas the Japanese were a disease of the skin. The problem is people in China did not like skin disease, and frankly, many of them were dying from skin disease. Everyone in China began to hate the Japanese so much and recognized them as such a palpable threat that he eventually was left with no choice. The turning point happened in Manchuria, where the bloodthirsty nature of the Japanese military reached its boiling point. On the night of September 18, 1931, a small explosion went off by a railway line in Mukden, today's Shenyang. Nobody was killed by it, nobody was injured. One train was barely damaged and derailed. It just so happened to be carrying Chinese warlord Zhang Xueliang. He was unbothered. The next train passed by minutes later, undeterred. And yet, the following morning, Japan declared that this was a violent act by Chinese dissidents and all but declared war on China. In the immortal words of LeBron James, something is real fishy going on. As it turns out, this explosion came from dynamite that was placed not by Chinese people, but by the Japanese army, specifically the Guangdong army that was created to protect Japanese territories in Manchuria. This became a key military force for the Japanese Empire because it was specialized in expansionist endeavors, fighting against the Chinese and Russians. Now, remember what I said about the increasing territorial expansion, getting more and more power for the military, in contrast to the civil government, which was more and more at the military's whims? Well, as it turns out, the army did this without any permission from the government. They decided on their own that they wanted to fight for more territory and nobody was going to stop them. So they staged their own false flag operation, and by their estimation, it worked. Nobody reined them in, and soon Japan staged a full-fledged intervention in Russia. 3 months later, as fighting continued in Manchuria, Japan's Prime Minister Wakatsuki Reijiro resigned, and Inukai Tsuyoshi took over at the direction of the last living Genro, Saionji Kinmochi. This is the last guy from the Meiji era that was advising Emperor Meiji. Inukai would try to succeed where Wakatsuki failed, rein in the military a little bit, rein a divided parliament in to push the nation towards gradual liberal reforms to address a tanking economy affected greatly by the Great Depression of 1929. But the Guangdong army kept capturing more and more cities in Manchuria and getting great press for it. The civil government, Tsuyoshi included, stood by and watched the army stage another false flag incident. this time in Shanghai in January 1932. They loved doing false flags, okay? They loved pretending that they got attacked so that they could invade somebody. Weeks earlier, they had staged an invasion in Jinzhou that even the emperor expressed opposition to. This was now Emperor Showa, or Hirohito, who had taken over after his father, who had an uninspiring reign as emperor and succumbed to illness. This part's kind of funny. By March, this Japanese army established a new puppet state, okay, in the Manchuria area. It was called Manchukuo. And a puppet state is basically, it's a fake state. It's a state that claims that it's an independent outgrowth from the people of a region, but really it's controlled by another government. Think Palestinian Authority. By May, as Prime Minister Tsuyoshi tried to go behind the military's back and establish some diplomatic relations with China, members of the Navy and the Army plotted a coup d'etat. 11 Navy officers under the age of 20 stormed into Tsuyoshi's residence and stabbed him. His last words were, allegedly, "If we could talk, you would understand," to which the officers replied, aptly, "Dialogue is useless." So when the time came for trials of these guys for killing the prime minister, the assassins bargained for the public. We were just fighting for the emperor. We were just fighting for the good of our nation to build more for Japan. And yeah, they aroused the whole nation, swept up in military glory, to demand a light sentence for them. It got to the fucking point where a group of young people sent the court a jar of their pickled pinky fingers, pleading for the court to try them instead of the assassins. Very normal stuff. Very healthy society. So after all this, what did the assassins get? A light prison sentence. Here's the lesson. You can kill the prime minister. You can kill the prime minister twice. It's gonna be fine, as long as you're doing it for the far right. Manchukuo, by the way, was a bit of a mess, okay? I found this funny earlier because they did not do a good job of convincing anybody that this was actually some sort of Manchurian independent state. Because remember how the Western nations were more and more suspicious of Japan? That's the reason they had to do any of this. They were like, oh shit, we just took a whole bunch of territory and the West doesn't want us to do that. How do we make it look as though we actually just helped a liberal independent government form and it's totally fine? The liberal civil government was like, we should probably just have diplomacy with China. But they were also, not exactly doing diplomatic things in terms of what their military was doing without their permission, let's say. Everybody knows you have to colonize gradually, over time, not all at once. Otherwise, the territory that you keep gaining will be easy to compromise. Your forces and resources will stretch thin, and you're going to make a ton of enemies in the process that you'll be increasingly helpless to resist. The military didn't care about that, though. Why would they care, Why would they care? Because every time that they took territory, people said that they were doing a great job and they would get more promotions and more money from the government. So who cares about the international order? Who cares about the diplomacy part? It's not relevant. Through this, whether they knew it or not, which I guess they really were honestly thinking this was for the best. But regardless of what they thought, this was the beginning of the end for the Japanese Empire. After the Japanese military took Manchuria, the media boomed more and more with excitement. Oh my god, this military is so great. It's so awesome. Meanwhile, Japan was scrambling to make Manchuria look like it had its own government. They went and recruited the last emperor of China, Puyi, who was a baby when Chinese empire fell. And he was like, okay, sure. Yeah, I'll be a state leader. I guess that's a thing I was trained to do anyway. So then when they announced the new puppet state of Manchukuo in October 1932, nobody recognized this state. Well, I shouldn't say nobody. The only two nations that approved were Germany and Italy, and thus began history's worst blunt rotation. Over the rest of the decade, war with China became inevitable. More and more prime ministers were assassinated by far-right military members, with a coup d'etat in 1936 marking the first time that the government actually came down with harsh sentencing against them. By then it was too late. All the liberals that wanted to do mild, stable, sustainable, non-MGO, homegrown colonialism were dead. Ultraviolence was the way. The Second Sino-Japanese War began in 1937. Japan went to war for the rest of China, but suddenly their military was weaker because it had been stretched so thin across not only China and its other territories, but against aggression for the more technologically advanced Soviet Union. In response, the military committed more and more egregious war crimes, most infamously the Nanjing Massacre, which we can touch on a little bit later. A more frustrated, less resourced Kwangtung army, led and empowered by far-right freaks, took out its feelings on innocent civilians through rape and slaughter. There was an infamous story published on the news in Japan about two soldiers who, boosting morale, competed over who could kill more people with a sword. Any pretense of the Empire of Japan and its military gaining international respect or any long-lasting stability was over. So, in 1876, the Treaty of Kanghwa marked the first success Japan had in opening Korea up for direct influence. Using the same move that the US did on Japan decades prior, Japan provoked an attack off of Kanghwa Island, demonstrated its superior force by killing over 30 Korean soldiers, and subsequently pushed Korea to sign an unequal treaty which opened up 3 of its ports for free trade and gave the Japanese extraterritorial jurisdiction, according to Gordon. After quelling peasant revolts in the late 19th century, as we kind of covered with the China section, Japan eventually gained full control of Korea in the 1900s after defeating Russia in the Russo-Japanese War. And again, famously, Russia took that loss very well and its monarchy remained super stable. So, from the late 19th century on, Korea had become a huge center for Japanese exports. In 1907, Japan disbanded the Korean military and monarchy. And in 1910, it officially annexed Korea. So, a few highlights, while all the other stuff in Japan is going on. First, we can talk about the violence Koreans suffered at the hands of Japan, because that's the stuff we seem to understand most immediately as wrong. Tons of Korean people were killed by the Japanese occupation. Many of these killings occurred in massacres, including ones in Chanmi, where dozens of unarmed civilians were shot to death by soldiers suspecting they were involved in anti-Japan protests. Afterwards, the soldiers burned down their church. Many such massacres of Koreans took place outside of Korea, though, most notably the Kanto Massacre. On the day of the devastating Great Kanto earthquake in 1923, didn't really mention that in the last section, but yeah. So in 1923, there was the Great Kanto earthquake, which had significant economic effects on Japan. And for weeks afterward, as Japan had built up this strong military state and continually eroded its civil government, as an article from the Georgetown Journal of International Affairs puts it, rumors spread that immigrants from Japan's then colony of Korea were poisoning wells and planning violent attacks on Japanese citizens. Japanese vigilante groups, backed by the police and army, responded by killing those they believed to be Korean. A 2009 official report cites figures of anywhere from 2,600 to 6,600 Korean victims from the massacre, as well as several hundred Chinese victims. And that speaks to the effects of how much nationalism was pushed on the Japanese people and how much it was embraced culturally as a part of the budding Empire of Japan, which at this point was sort of at its apex. Now, aside from straightforward violent genocidal acts like these, Japanese rule over Korea is also known for its cultural genocide. Now, as international law researcher Elisa Novich described it years ago, cultural genocide is the systematic destruction of traditions, values, language, and other elements that make one group of people distinct from another. Japanization was a huge part of Japanese colonial policy, particularly in Korea. Korea is the case that really highlights this. Notably, the policy of Soshikaime mandated that every Korean remove their Korean name and instead take a Japanese name. Additionally, the Korean language, whose alphabet, by the way, is commonly seen around the world as something to be hailed because of its simplicity and efficiency, was banned in Korea by the Japanese. There's a show based on a book called Pachinko that is actually on Apple Music. Not Apple Music, because that's where music is. Apple TV, where TV is. And if you're interested in some of the personal after effects and legacies of this Japanization in Korea, you might want to check that out. But in between violent genocide and cultural genocide was another type of violence and cultural violence, a war crime which remains at the center of Japanese colonial legacy to this day, that being the comfort women. As we touched on in our video about the 4B movement, young Korean women were kidnapped and taken to former Japanese military installations, such as comfort stations, for a certain period during wartime in the past, and forced to provide sexual services to officers and soldiers. See Sarah So's 2020 book, The Comfort Women, Sexual violence and post-colonial memory in Korea and Japan provides an anthropological analysis, pointing out the norms of Korean patriarchy as part of facilitating this sexual slavery violently imposed by the colonial entity. And that has important ramifications in terms of nationalism in Korea, and that's something that relates to more so what we'll talk about after this section. In C. Saracel's book, she examines numerous testimonies of women who came from a variety of backgrounds. Some fit the mold of the Korean nationalist narrative, coming from poverty, being physically dragged away by Japanese soldiers, but many were also women from decent socioeconomic backgrounds who were abused by their fathers for seeking education, who left home to find independence, who were told by Korean male strangers that they entrusted that they had a job for them, only to have been deceived, bought and sold off to brothels. And I think that connects with an important conversation being raised about sexual trafficking. There's a video that I will put on screen by a content creator who is taking this topic on, in particular, talking about how sex trafficking is common and how in most cases it appears in a way that we don't necessarily consider sexual trafficking, but of course is just as damaging as the typical stories of violent kidnapping of unsuspecting young people. Much of the book delves into the creation of the paradigmatic victim stories that Korean right-wing nationalists have seized on in the past few decades. Here, I'm going to focus on Japan's role given the subject of the video. Of the origins and reasoning behind this sexual slavery, So writes, based on fascistic statism, racism, and sexism, it regarded the comfort women as considerate gifts to the emperor's warriors for recreational sex. The state and military leadership conceived of the Ianjo as a facility where Japanese servicemen could obtain a quick commercial service for public sex and psychic comfort from a young woman who would satisfy their presumably uncontrollable libidos. Accordingly, the state endorsed the military's recruitment of young females from its colonies, Korea and Taiwan, with the expectation that the comfort system would, among other benefits, raise military morale. The perspective of the troops and apparently some government officials of contemporary Japan and many conservative Japanese citizens as well conceived of the comfort system simplistically as a military version of licensed prostitution available in Imperial Japan and its colonies. But comfort women were not just symptoms of an ordinary prostitution. Ultimately, yes, they were kidnapped, they were enslaved, and they were often children. But that's the case with sex trafficking by and large. What's different and unique about this was how it was potentially systematized by the Japanese Empire, read Japanese military, in order to empower or to placate its soldiers. There's some scholarly evidence suggesting that this was a result of seeing the of Nanking, something again we'll touch on a bit later when it comes to denialism, but a response essentially by Japanese military officials to say, well, these guys are out here perpetrating crimes and war crimes out in the field. It seems like we shouldn't have them do that. So instead, let's just set up brothels for them with people that we kidnap from the colonies. That said, although this war crime was systematized to some degree by the military, the reality was that depending on where you were enslaved and where you were from, your treatment and the condition you were left in could vary tremendously. And in reality, sex slaves were from many different places. I think we can agree that sex slavery is bad, but there can also be variations of just how bad it can get. The thing about the Japanese military is they hit on all those different levels. While some comfort stations were concessionary, built intentionally and with some level of planning by the Japanese military, many, especially toward the end of World War II in the 1940s, were even seedier, built shoddily by Japanese soldiers on the battlefront. As So writes, a general picture of the criminal Ianjo may be drawn from the testimonials of Filipino victim survivors who lived in provincial towns near the battlefronts after the Japanese invasion in December 1941. Their personal ordeals included being caught by soldiers and raped in the field before being brought to a garrison where they were forced into sexual slavery. Among the 22 Filipino women whose testimonials have been published, the majority had been held between 1 week and a few months, but 5 stated they had been held for more than a year. Most managed to escape when they were not being watched or when the American military started bombing. The testimony of one Filipino woman is especially haunting. Maria Rosa Hansen, who in 1992 became the first Filipina to come out as a former Ianfu, described the criminal type of Ianjo in some detail in her autobiography. Hansen was carrying food and medicine to help the Filipino guerrilla movement when a Japanese soldier at a checkpoint took her at gunpoint to a comfort station in April 1943. That Ianjo, which was operated as a sort of impromptu rape camp, was located on the second floor of the building that had been the town hospital but had been turned into the Japanese headquarters and garrison. Hansen found 6 other women there. Hansen was given a small room which had a bamboo bed and a curtain but no door. Soldiers stood guard in the hall outside the rooms. The next day, a soldier entered her room and pointed his bayonet at her chest. He used his bayonet to tear her dress open before he raped her. When he was finished, other soldiers took turns. This is not to say that Southeast Asia was only subject to the shoddy comfort stations. In Manila, concessionary comfort houses were much more common, and included special restaurants and what U.S. Army intelligence reports translated as houses of relaxation for the military. But this was just one of numerous rampant war crimes prevalent throughout Japan's World War II campaign that saw them invade and wage battles on swaths of territory across Asia. Here are some of the biggest ones. In the Alexandra Hospital massacre, Japanese soldiers launched an assault on a barracks hospital for British soldiers defending Singapore. An envoy was sent to wave a white flag and surrender, but was killed with a bayonet. The Japanese soldiers wanted blood. They killed up to 50 soldiers the first night, with some being killed while undergoing surgery. They also killed numerous nurses and doctors. The next day, they sent about 200 men, comprised of medical staff and patients who were often walking wounded, to march to a poorly ventilated industrial area. Those who fell on the way were killed. Some were also killed overnight from their wounds and poor habitation. Overall, between 150 to 200 staff and patients were killed. In the Calagon massacre, Japanese soldiers killed an estimate of at least 600 civilians in Calagon, Burma, after getting word that some were collaborating with British special forces. Men, women, and children were tied together in groups of 4 to 10, taken from the village blindfolded, bayoneted, and thrown down nearby wells. They also took 10 women who they said had agreed to act as spies, but who were probably intended for enforced military prostitution as so-called comfort women. In the Palawan massacre, Japanese soldiers killed 139 prisoners of war by cramming them into 3 shelters, setting them ablaze, and fired machine guns at the few who managed to escape while ablaze. The Bataan Death March took place after Japan's victory in the Battle of Bataan in World War II. Japanese army rounded up Filipino and American soldiers and forced them to march 65 miles, a trek that would take around 5 days. The soldiers were starved and beaten on the march. Thousands died, with figures varying greatly given the difficulty of pinpointing such a number. The figures usually range from around 5,000 to around 16,000, with Filipinos making up a significant majority of those deaths. Sukching was a systematic genocide occurring in Singapore from February 18th to March 4th of 1942, after the small Southeast Asian city-state was taken from British forces. Chinese Singaporeans were detained arbitrarily, reasons varying from communist ties to arms possession to wearing glasses because they were assumed to be educated and therefore guilty. Unofficial estimates of the overall number of deaths reach as high as 50,000. The racialized nature of the massacre of Sukching highlights another problem with nationalism as a narrative: the blurriness of victims. Japanese war crimes killed people across national and ethnic lines. Chinese people were killed in Southeast Asia. Southeast Asians were killed in China. Perhaps the greatest example, though, of the variance of victims of Imperial Japan's war crimes, and really its most psychologically disturbing atrocities, is a site which existed in China but contained victims from all over the map. This is Elliot from the future. Hi. In case you were wondering why on earth Japan ended up so much in Southeast Asia like this in the first place, think of it as just an extension of the Japanese military doing its expansionism thing. After attacking Pearl Harbor, Japan announced its intentions to create a Pan-Asian Union that would resist Western hegemony, and of course this would be centered on Japan as the leader. As Gordon writes, in 1940, as a prelude to the move into Indochina, the government expanded its vision to call for creation of a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere that included Southeast Asia. But neither the military nor the bureaucracy had made extensive plans for consolidating control of these new possessions. Officials improvised their strategy as they went along. They ruled the older colonies more harshly than ever. In Korea, the government general mobilized students into factories and imposed a massive migration on as many as 4 million adults. They were forced to work as mine workers in Japan and as prison guards and laborers building airstrips in China. So, there you go. This is the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. It was just an ideal. It was playing on the central trauma of Japanese empire, which is the West has come to dominate us. But obviously, it was just a thin layer of justification for Japan to expand more and more and to just do whatever it wanted with weaker Asian nations, potential nations, territories, etc. It took 2 years after the initial announcement of the co-prosperity sphere for Japan to even begin trying to organize the thing. The government did not begin planning for a Greater East Asia Ministry until the spring of 1942, and it founded the ministry in November of that year. The ministry never became a powerful agency of integrated control. Representatives of the 5 states that constituted the co-prosperity sphere, Burma, Thailand, China under Wang Jingwei, the Philippines, and Manchukuo, held just one Greater East Asia Conference in Tokyo in November 1943. It was marked by praise for Pan-Asian solidarity and condemnation of Western imperialism, but, of course, few practical plans to integrate or develop the region economically. Of course was me, by the way. I added that. At the heart of all of Japan's imperial projects, though, was racial superiority. Duh. They could use language of co-prosperity all they liked. The rhetoric used in Japanese domestic propaganda was extremely prejudiced, promoting an idea of Japanese racial supremacy, of Japan as not only part of the hard-working yellow race, but a uniquely pure people within it. One academic with a radio program laid out his theory of the Japanese people as an original man. All culture and religious activity are united under Japan's emperor. Originally, the Asiatic race came from a Japanese strain. The Indians of America are of the Asiatic race. Asiatic culture is the origin of world culture. Yeah, sounds like Nazi shit to me. There's a good paper called Race and Empire in Meiji Japan, which is an introduction to a larger book. It's in the Asia Pacific Journal website, so you can check that out for more information on this. But we've even touched on already some of the racism that was prevalent, for instance, in Okinawa and Hokkaido during the Empire's reign of terror. So there you go. Now, before I go over that place, let's just go over really quickly how World War II shook out for Japan. When Fumimaro Konoe took over the prime minister position in 1939, the military officially became the most powerful entity in Japan, with the civil government now choosing to crack down on any civil unrest due to economic troubles through regimented authoritarianism. But the military was unable to achieve any lasting strategic victory in China, and as it further expanded into Southeast Asia, the US responded with trade embargoes. Those used to be really powerful back in the day. When the US embargoed you, you really felt it. Not as much in 2025. That said, the US wasn't going to send in troops. I think you kind of know how this story goes. Though Fumimaro and the government attempted to negotiate peace between US and Japan, Japan was ultimately unwilling to let go of any of the territories that the US wanted it to, which led to the decision to surprise attack Pearl Harbor on a date which will live in infamy. This led to the last few years of World War II, in which Japan was continually getting exposed in its military and attempted to occupy more and more parts of Southeast Asia previously owned by the West, which ended up setting the stage for later independence movements in countries like Indonesia, Singapore, Vietnam, and the Philippines. The Japanese government screwed its people over during this process over and over again, centralizing control more and more of the economy towards deploying military resources. The businesses of Japan ended up having to produce more and more for the military instead of things back home, which led to these black markets developing. The economy was in shambles. The standards of living tanked in Japan, and despite all of this effort being put into the military and expansionism, this just didn't work out for Japan in terms of winning World War II, as you may know. This was capped off by the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which the YouTuber Sean made an excellent video about a few years ago, in case you want to watch, a few more hours about Imperial Japanese history. Overall, guys, in World War II, Japan invaded South Sakhalin, now part of Russia, several parts of mainland China, Hong Kong, in East Asia, and then Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, Malaysia, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, Singapore, which we touched on in our video about Singapore, Burma, East Timor, and Southeast Asia, and then New Guinea, Guam, South Seas Mandate, Nauru, Wake Island, and Kiribati in the Pacific Islands. And that's not counting invasions attempted in parts of India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Australia, Canada, and parts of Alaska and Hawaii, which were controlled, of course, by the US. Oh boy, what to do about all that? The International Military Tribunal of the Far East, or the Tokyo Trials, took place half a year after Japan's surrender, which, by the way, only happened, even with the nuclear bombs, because the Emperor of Japan was like, I want to be preserved. I want the Emperor to remain a part of Japan. I would like to make sure that my butt is saved. And the US was like, fine. Otherwise, the Emperor would have been one of many people facing execution at these trials for all manner of war crimes. 28 military officials and political officials stood trial and were charged with 55 separate international crimes. Crimes against peace, war crimes, those are apparently two different things, and crimes against humanity, also a different thing. One of them was Koki Hirota, a politician who served as prime minister in 1936 and 1937. And if you remember how things were going in politics in Japan at that time, you would know that that meant he didn't really have any authority over the military. Regardless, he was charged with counts of waging wars of aggression, waging unprovoked war against the Republic of China, and disregard for duty to prevent breaches of the laws of war. This is despite some historical work that has shown Koki Hirota was opposed to aggression against China and wanted to slow down the influence of the military. Regardless, he was then executed for his crimes, the only civilian to be tried as such. Meanwhile, our guy Hirohito was fine. He lived on until 1989 despite having supreme command of the civil government and military and refusing to step in when crimes were committed. And remember, the far right of the military, which took power more and more, continuously used the emperor. The restoration of the power of the emperor and the emperor's mandate and the power of the empire as the reasoning for why they did what they did. So what gives? Why didn't the US get rid of Hirohito? Why didn't the US get rid of the emperor position? That's a bit controversial, but generally the supreme commander of the Allied powers, General Douglas MacArthur, who took over the occupation of Japan essentially after World War II, reasoned that deposing and trying the emperor would be too destabilizing to the Japanese populace and thus make US objectives in Japan much more difficult to accomplish. US objectives. So much to say about those. For instance, do you know who else was absent at the Tokyo trials? One Shiro Ishii. Who was Shiro Ishii, you ask? Well, he was just the foremost figure of biological warfare for the Imperial Japanese Army, and the director of Unit 731. The biological and chemical warfare research and development complex of Imperial Japan based in a small district of Harbin in Manchuria, then Manchukuo. Prior to the establishment of this wonderful place, Ishii worked his way up through the Japanese military through espousing the necessary usage of biological warfare, which was warmly received by Guangdong Army officials. As Sheldon H. Harris writes in Factories of Death, the militarist hierarchy, calculating that the Bolsheviks greatly outnumbered the Japanese, concluded that biological warfare would be an important weapon as a counterweight in such a future conflict. Basically, Russia's big and scary, they got biological weapons, Japan needs some too. So Ishii, who'd made himself the figurehead of this movement alongside the army, constructed their first facility, the Jongma Fortress in Beiyinhe in 1932. It would routinely host 500 to 700 prisoners, a mixed lot, let's say, that included everyone from Chinese guerrilla fighters to innocents who happened to be caught in a roundup of suspicious persons. As you know, you should always trust governments when they round people up for being suspicious, especially during wartime. Prisoners, stuck in small cells, would have 500 cubic centimeters of blood drawn from them every 3 to 5 days, which left them weaker and weaker until eventually they were injected with poison and their bodies were dissected. Some prisoners, Harris writes, who Ishii or one of his subordinates determined were no longer useful experimental subjects, were simply shot to death by a member of the Togo unit. Somehow a better fate. In one experiment, 3 communist soldiers were injected with a bacterium gained from the plague-infected fleas of 40 mice, which made them, in Harris's words, delirious with fever, with one of them reaching a temperature of 40 degrees Celsius. It was these experiments that showed Ishii the power of using cholera and bubonic plague as a war weapon, which would later be deployed in 1940 in Ningbo to create a plague epidemic that would later kill around 1,500 people. So that's before Unit 731. Some of you might already know what happened in Unit 731, or some degree of it. Let's just go over that really quickly. Unit 731 was established in the late 1930s in Pyeongfang, a now closed-off district in Harbin, under the auspices of research in conducting biological warfare. In the formal inauguration speech, Ishii prepared its workers thusly. And for the audience, I just want you to picture what it would be like to start working at a new facility you've been transferred to, and the leader of it gives a speech at the beginning like this. Our God-given mission as doctors is to challenge all varieties of disease-causing microorganisms, to block all roads of intrusion into the human body, to annihilate all foreign matter residents in our bodies, and to devise the most expeditious treatment possible. Sounds like medical work, right? However, the research work upon which we are now about to embark is completely the opposite of these principles, and may cause us some anguish as doctors. Nevertheless, I beseech you to pursue this research based on the dual thrill of 1. A scientist to exert efforts to probing for the truth in natural science and research into and discovery of the unknown world, and 2. As a military person to successfully build a powerful military weapon against the enemy. Meanwhile, Japanese officials kind of reasserted to people, locals in the area, that, according to Harris, the area was being developed as a lumber mill. So victims were prisoners. They were rounded up and sent to Unit 731 in the dead of night by military posts and special service. They called the people who were being taken in marutas, logs. These victims were mostly Chinese, but they included also stateless white Russians, including longtime resident Harbin Jews, Soviet prisoners captured in 1939 and 1940 border skirmishes, Mongolians, Koreans, Europeans of various nationalities accused of an assortment of crimes, including spying, and Sheldon Harris uses the term the mentally handicapped. And again, sometimes when there was a desperate need for new prisoners in the area, they would round up suspicious-looking people around. So prisoners were experimented on. Pathogens of all kinds were tested on them to see how the body would react to numerous conditions, foods, fluids, and potential treatments. One such experiment was the frostbite experiment, which apparently has contributed greatly to information we know now about how frostbite works. Get into a little bit of why that might be the case in a second. In these frostbite experiments, prisoners were sent outside into temperatures below -20 degrees, I believe Fahrenheit, with bare arms, which were made to freeze with the help of an artificial current of air. So you're blowing extra air onto these arms in this freezing temperature. This was done until their frozen arms, when struck with a short stick, emitted a sound resembling that which a board gives out when it is struck. This was the account from one Nishi Toshihide, a medical officer that worked there. These were doctors. These were people that wanted to be doctors, that studied to be doctors, that were mobilized by their government to do this to people. Sexual violence and rape was also prominent at Unit 731, often under the guises of doing sexual education and testing venereal diseases. 4 or 5 unit members dressed in white laboratory clothing completely covered the body with only eyes and mouth visible, handled the tests. A male and female, one infected with syphilis, would be brought together in a cell and forced into sex with each other. It was made clear that anyone resisting would be shot. Pregnancy was not uncommon. Women prisoners were forced to become pregnant for use in experiments. Specifically, the plausibility of vertical transmission from mother to fetus or child of diseases was tested. This was especially true in the case of syphilis, which was suspected to affect fertility. Whether or not a fetus survived and if its mother's reproductive organs were compromised was of great interest to practitioners at 731. Though a large number of babies were born in captivity of Unit 731, there has been no account of any survivors of the facility, children included. It is suspected that the children of female prisoners were killed or the pregnancies terminated. Again, there were no survivors of Unit 731. Sometimes findings from Unit 731 were published, often under disguises though, obviously. As Harris writes, researchers published or read more than 100 scientific papers, both during the heyday of Unit 731's operation, as well as in the post-war period. When dealing with humans, the researchers referred to experiments with monkeys or Manchurian monkeys. Animal experiments were labeled with the animals as proper subspecies, such as long-tailed monkey, Taiwan monkey, or Formosan monkey. In Japanese medical society, their human experiments were known, that is, were an open secret. There has been plenty of coverage of Unit 731. These are just some essential details that I gleaned from it. I suggest reading Harris's book for more information, of course. You can also just search Unit 731 into YouTube and see what you find. The most pressing part for this section of the video, though, is why Ishii and others involved in this and other human experimentation and chemical warfare were not tried. Now, it's not that the US didn't know about it in time. In 1945, soon after Japan's surrender, an incomplete investigation led by Lieutenant Colonel Murray Sanders indicated conclusively that Japan was a major biological weapon power, and that Ishii was a most important figure in its program. Later reports and investigations in 1946 and early 1947 made it quite evident that Japanese biological war researchers had conducted inquiries using methods involving human rights violations, and that Ishii had probably participated in these practices. But the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal of 1946 barely made any reference to the Japanese using chemical weapons at all. That's because earlier that year, Shiro Ishii met with the US. Now, the US was highly curious about how to deal with biological warfare, deal with it, also maybe use it, but could only rely on limited data about animals and had no understanding of what instruments could be used to deliver mass disease. The Soviets had taken over Manchuria post-surrender, and the Soviet Union and the US were both very guarded with each other about information on biological weapons, much less any info gained by the Japanese in this regard. So Ishii and the other analysts at Unit 731, physicians, experts, etc., knowing the political situation, used their information. They traded it in secretly for the US to give them immunity. By early February 1946, the authorities had a list of more than 20 former high-ranking officers and academics who had potentially damning information concerning Ishii. The Adjutant General's investigators continued to find additional damaging evidence, but the civilian and military people concerned with obtaining biological weapons data evidently possessed sufficient influence to be able either to impugn or to ignore the findings. The SWNCC, a committee coordinated by the government and military with regards to occupying the Axis powers after World War II, including Japan, justified this decision internally essentially by saying, what if the communists find out about this? Since it is believed that the USSR possesses only a small portion of this technical information, and since any war crimes trial would completely reveal such data to all nations, it is felt that such publicity must be avoided in interests of defense and security of the US. And this is the reality of World War II, and the controversial legacy of the Japanese Empire. The war was taught to us in the West, in our schooling, as a fight between good and evil. Our friends in Europe and Asia wanted power and they got too far out of hand, and so we had to step in and fight them and save the day. And now we got peace. We got peace everywhere. Isn't it great? The reality is, as Henry Kissinger once put it in between eating human flesh or whatever else that guy did, America has no permanent friends or enemies, only interests. The Japanese were enemies only when they undermined our interests, when they destabilized trade in Asia that we really wanted, or took territories in the Pacific that we really cared about, some of which we owned. But when they had information that we needed, especially when it comes to beating the communists, the US and Japan were best friends, baby. And this theme was central to the post-World War II rise of Japan. I hope it's visible. Folks, the story of Imperial Japan begins and ends the same way, with treaties. Unequal ones, that is. After Emperor Hirohito gave his radio speech, shocking not only for its content announcing total surrender of World War II, but also in how high-pitched his voice was. Many Japanese people had never heard his voice before and were like, huh, really? He sounds like that? The Allied powers began their occupation of Japan. This is going to be a running problem. General Douglas MacArthur was named Supreme Commander of the Allied Powers, or SCAP, which would become the term later used to refer to either MacArthur or his governing body. As Gordon writes, the Allies had two goals in Japan: to demilitarize and democratize. And of course, as you know, anytime that the US talks about democratizing a place, good things ensue. Always good things. Post-war Japan is a complicated and controversial subject. The mainstream historical narrative is more or less glowing towards US interests. The US got rid of tyranny in Japan and instilled democracy and liberal core values that helped resurrect the economy and bring Japan to the glowing state it's in today. But you and I know that's not exactly how politics works. The US saw in Japan a nation in close proximity to China and the Soviet Union, with the capacity to build significant industry, which had previously been mobilized towards the Japanese military. Now, at first, SCAP put in some reforms that empowered unionization, that dissolved some of the zaibatsu, meaning, the capitalist ownership concentrated in a small group of families, and also dissolved some of the landlordism in agrarian areas. But once tensions with the Soviet Union and the newly communist China rose up, plans were kind of pushed to the side, let's say. The need to rapidly industrialize Japan and remilitarize it, albeit for US forces instead of Japanese ones, became as pressing as ever. And so this begins the famous reverse course shift, that's what they call it, where the US and Western allies began to resist the Soviet Union's increasing imperial growth through changing course in terms of its economic policies and development policies in Japan. You get what I'm saying. There was a contingency growing in Japan advising MacArthur to make reforms of the nation more modest. We're giving power to the unions a little too much. We're trying to make things a little too equal over there, and that's not really necessary. Gordon writes that these views held that the war was a slight misstep in which a few militarists had hijacked a relatively sound and well-run ship of state. Simply dismantling the military and putting in place the basic laws of political democracy would be enough. Other reforms went too far, they argued, towards a dangerously socially based democracy of the masses. They advocated handing power back to the responsible elements of the pre-war elite, business leaders and relatively pro-Western foreign ministry veterans such as Shirehara Kijuro and Yoshida Shigeru. They supported using the emperor as an anchor to keep Japan socially conservative and cohesive. Keep that last sentence in mind, man. That's exactly what we're going to be talking about here. So they started outlawing labor strikes and tamping down on communist and socialist parties. And SCAP aggressively privatized industry, cutting off government loans programs to businesses, but the hardly floating Japanese economy was only going to decline further and further. Things were getting worse, until, that is, the Korean War. During the Korean War, Japan's placed very close to Korea, and the US military secured procurement from the Japanese industry, which amounted to about $2 million, or roughly 60% of all Japan's exports. Then Prime Minister Shigeru Yoshida called it a gift from the gods. We're really tactful with how we talk about massive losses of life here. Make no mistake though, the Korean War, which was a proxy war between the US and Soviet Union through South Korea and North Korea respectively, was what jump-started the Japanese economy. We have no Japanese economic boom without it. I'll leave you to make of that what you will. Maybe you'll have some theories about why that war was started in the first place. In 1951, Japan signed the Treaty of San Francisco, officially establishing peace between it and the Allied powers. It also signed the first US-Japan Security Treaty, which allowed the US to maintain military bases in Japan, throughout Japan, and to be able to use those military forces without notifying the Japanese government. These terms had no end date. This was the indefinite state of affairs, and it shocked many throughout Japan, which set the table for a turbulent decade of protest and state repression. An event called Bloody May Day, springing from riots, took place right after this was signed, triggering ongoing negotiations. 8 years afterward, a revised version of the treaty sparked even more protest. This version of the treaty, the Anpo Treaty as it was called, upheld the general gist of the original. As Gordon writes, American bases would protect Japan, and the Japanese would accept the bases, help pay for them, and help protect them in an emergency. The Japanese left led nationwide popular protests against the treaty. Socialists, student groups, women's groups, and even some in the LDP objected to the prospect of a nearly permanent subordinate independence under American hegemony. In May of 1960, Prime Minister Nobusuke Kishi and his government had to physically carry the Speaker of the Lower House sideways through a crowd of opposition politicians to rush through a vote approving the treaty. The backlash was seismic, as you can imagine. On June 15th of 1960, protesters broke their way into Japanese parliament. A violent conflict with police broke out, which killed a student named Michiko Kanba. This basically forced Kishi to resign right after signing the treaty because it was such an unpopular move, but the task was completed. The US secured its military hegemony over Japan. In response, Japan had in the US something that could springboard their new economic and cultural direction. Let's talk about the art of the deal. We hear a lot today about how Donald Trump, current president, is destroying the US's histories and traditions of strong international alliances and diplomatic relations by, bursting down the door and demanding that Ukraine pay us back and more for defending them in a war with Russia. Now, Trump's idiocy and barbarism aside, let's ask a question here. What exactly is US diplomacy? What does it do? Who is it for? The case of Japan is instructive. The US has established itself as a global power by boosting capitalist economies throughout the world through proxy wars against the Soviet Union, which in turn gave them strong allies in many strategic locations to fight the rise of communism. The deal Japan gained from the US, in this light, was simple. First and foremost, as we've mentioned a couple times, Japan kept its emperor. It helped keep social conservatism, some kind of power in Japan. And you gotta remember, the emperor was a symbol of Japan's ideal uniqueness, its uniqueness from other Asian nations, and, the purity of its race in a lot of ways. And also, of course, its nationalist leanings. The emperor came into power once again through the Meiji Restoration and the rise of the Japanese Empire. So this is not so much a win for the Japanese people, but it's very much a win for the emperor and the people that were associated with him. Second, Japan would also establish a liberal democracy with universal suffrage. But this liberal democracy would be dominated by one party, the Liberal Democratic Party, or LDP, which was financed by the business elites of Japan who had just gotten rich off of the Korean War, thanks to the US. So this is a party that gained power in a time where there was a lot of political fracturing because it had a lot of money and was affiliated with US business interests. And it has been the party of Japan for basically every election since then. It is a one-party state. Thanks to the LDP, the US had in Japan a focal ally for its economy and of course for its military, where it could spy on China and North Korea and the Soviet Union and continue to assert economic hegemony in the Pacific. Okinawa represents a focal point in Japan of this military dominance. There are a ton of bases in Okinawa for US Marines, Air Force, Army, and Navy, and to this day its name is synonymous with Army brats in the US. The thing is, the people of Okinawa, who you'll remember were at one point an indigenous people, the Ryukyuans, not exactly thrilled that their island is being used for US military purposes. As Gavin McCormick wrote for Jacobin in 2022, the danger of being embroiled in conflict, combined with the land grabbing of foreign military bases and the many abuses committed by US soldiers, have stoked passionate opposition to the US presence. However, the authorities in Tokyo have repeatedly thwarted efforts to close and return the bases, committed as they are to a role as Washington's client state in the region. Third, Client State is the title of McCormick's 2007 book about Japan's relationship with the US, wherein he notes that Japan's subordination to the US was part of the plan since even before the end of World War II. Like, do you remember SCAP? Do you remember also Manchukuo, the state, the puppet state that Japan established in Manchuria when they invaded it? You remember how they had Puyi, who was the emperor, the last emperor of China as a little kid and was deposed, and then they were like, this guy's actually the real emperor and leader of the state here in Manchuria. But it was obvious that he wasn't actually ruling over anything because it was Japan's state. The early 1942 advice to the U.S. Department of State by Edwin Reischauer was that Japan after the war should be turned into America's puppet, with its emperor functioning on behalf of the U.S., much as Puyi, China's last emperor, functioned in Manchukuo until 1945 on Japan's behalf, a puppet who not only could be won over to our side, but who would carry with him a tremendous weight of authority. Uh-oh, we did an Empire of Japan on the Empire of Japan. McCormick's central claim is that Japan and its widely lauded economic miracle were a result of this deal. Japan became rich by swallowing its pride, forgetting about national glory and even about national identity and prestige during the decades of the Cold War, concentrating on producing goods of high quality, cheaply for world markets. It surrendered control over defense and foreign policy to the US in return for the rights to protect its nascent industries, and for privileged access to technology, capital, and markets within the free world. By the late 1980s, it seemed that the deal had paid off handsomely. Wealth multiplied and hearts thrilled to the prospect of becoming #1, a prospect that seemed almost within grasp. Now, if you know what was going on at the same time in US history, you'll understand just how important the US economy was to this Japanese economic boom. So the US was dominated by industrial production in the early part of the 20th century, namely through the Fordist model of assembly line manufacturing. And this was especially prevalent in the state of Michigan, in Detroit, the capital of Michigan. Is it the capital? It's the biggest city in Michigan, where they had Ford Motor Company. We were the key producers of automobiles around the world, as well as a ton of other home appliances and electronics, etc. But the factory system and its rampant exploitation of workers in close proximity to each other paved the way for the rise of unions. I'm taking this hat off, dude. My hair probably looks like shit, but it's fine. The hat is just not fitting. Union strength, propelled by American communists and Marxist theory, reached its apex in a post-war landscape, in a New Deal America where so many working class people could become middle class and were able to buy homes and start good old Christian patriarchal families in the suburbs. This cut into the profits of American capital. And so they had a bit of a conundrum. In Japan, communists and socialists were also reaching a ton of popularity. And so American capitalists made a deal with Japanese capitalists to kill two birds with one stone. Two red birds, that is. We're going to send the working class of America into war with Korea, which will kickstart the production in Japan, massive production to enriching its capitalists, which we went over. Then we're going to transition that production after the war towards automobiles and other appliances, which will kill production industries in the United States in the process, because now the US can import well-made automobiles and other things produced in Japan at a cheaper price than they would get it from workers in the US. And this is perhaps the central story of globalization. In today's world, labor is as weak as ever because production has been sent into the periphery. Your shoes, your phone parts, they're all mined and manufactured, at least in part, in some of the poorest parts of the world for little to no wages. Maybe the best illustration of just how messed up this dynamic was for people who weren't rich in either country was the 1982 murder of Vincent Chin. The heightening tensions between workers who were usually white in the US, who had experienced continuous layoffs in the factories due to a shift towards Japanese production, reached a boiling point one night in Michigan, where two white workers, one a supervisor at a Chrysler plant and another his stepson, who was just laid off from the company, beat a Chinese man named Vincent Chin to death with a baseball bat because they thought he was Japanese. Now, these two men each got 3 years of probation for this crime. You can't really punish your white worker base for lashing out sometimes. How else are you gonna, keep them getting poorer and poorer? They've got to take their anger out somewhere, and it can't be at you. Regardless, by this time period, this wonderful flourishing time period, the 1980s, it seemed as though we had killed communism once and for all. The Soviet Union was on the brink of collapse, China was opening up more and more to the rest of the world through neoliberal reforms, Japan was rich, and the US was richer. And then the 90s came. Okay, we're not gonna do amateurish economic analysis. To put things simply, when economies get too hot and they're not regulated at all, or well at all, the financial sectors become overconfident. This is what makes economic bubbles. Think the dot-com bubble in the 90s, or of course, the bubble of 2008 that caused the global recession with the real estate markets, or the bubble we're about to be in now with AI and God knows what else. So a bubble had formed in Japan in the late 80s and early 90s, which caused its economy to stagnate significantly. In response, Japan did what the US likes to do. It began to privatize national programs, notably the National Railway. Everything became too expensive, and the governments eroded more and more safety nets that people could hang on to. And so the population became increasingly indebted and birth rates declined. Now, when capitalist economies go bad like this, the right wing starts to gain more power in politics. They offer reactionary ideas to people, ones of pride in one's national identity and culture, and how we can pick ourselves up by our bootstraps because we're strong people of this nation. And they do this while increasingly privatizing the economy, giving tax breaks to the wealthy, and eroding social safety nets more and more for the poor and working classes, thus creating a larger and larger wealth gap. And this move works in two ways when it comes to the right wing. One, we make it harder for you to live so the rich can pay off their debts and move more freely with their money. And then, because you're angry at how bad things are, we give you the people to hate. That way we can signal to you that we know a problem is happening, but we can also misdirect you into thinking that the problem is somewhere else, like with immigrants, or with leftists, or with trans people, with women, with gay people, disabled people, etc. And if we're in a position to, we usually start hyping up our militaries, because the one surefire way we can make everyone in the country richer is by taking over somebody else's land. Well, that's the theory anyway. Now, of course, Japan did not have a domestic military that was allowed to invade anywhere else in the world. But it was essentially tethered to the US military in acting on its behalf. And so, when Junichiro Koizumi took office in 2001, he had a complex task on his hands. He would need to further Japan's already overwhelming reliance and subordination to the US, and also not piss people off terribly much, because Japanese people are very sensitive to the idea that they are stuck subordinate to the US, and there has been obviously a history of resistance to that idea, histories of protest against periods of time when the government seemed to be acquiescing to the US too much. We saw that with Anpo, right? And so here comes this guy, Junichiro Koizumi, right? He's got his open button-up shirt and his rolled-up sleeves, and he really likes Elvis, okay? He really likes Elvis and old-school rock and roll music. There's one point where, because he was so buddy-buddy with George W. Bush, George W. Bush took him to Graceland, and he's like doing this, he's like doing Elvis poses, he's singing Elvis songs in interviews with American reporters. We're just, oh, what a charismatic guy, right?
Make me sleep with the lights. Let me know where I stand from the start. I want you, I need you, I love you.
And in addition to being buddy-buddy to US culture, of course he was buddy-buddy to US economic interests. He invested a ton into private banking in Japan and, again, eroded social safety nets. You know the playbook. All of this was to bring in more and more US capital to Japan in a time period where they wanted injections of cash from somewhere. He even remilitarized Japan in the rest of the world for the first time, albeit because Japan sent troops to Iraq to back up the United States. A small amount of troops, of course, and they mostly did, reconnaissance missions or reconstruction and support missions. Now, as unprecedented as this move was, Japan was sending troops, Japanese troops, somewhere else in the world. Didn't we have a whole agreement that this wouldn't happen? Of course, this was inevitable. Its own government knew this was inevitable. Consider the words of Kyuma Fumio, head of the LDP's Research Council in 2003. I think Japan has no choice. After all, it is like an American state. There you have it. But perhaps the most infamous part of Junichiro Koizumi's legacy in Japan was his frequent visits to the Yasukuni Shrine, a privately owned Shinto shrine that was created by Emperor Meiji in 1869 to honor the war dead of the Empire of Japan. Yasukuni holds within it commemorations for various war criminals, as well as many soldiers who participated in imperialist wars against Korea and China. Koizumi made a big stink. He created a huge controversy when he began visiting this shrine in 2001, early in his tenure as prime minister. Prior to that, since 1983, the shrine, according to McCormick, was perceived as so damaging to Japan's diplomacy that prime ministers refrained from association with it. Now, of course, the pushback from other Asian nations, namely Korea and China, but also everybody else that Japan affected in World War II, was very strong. It was a strong pushback. And it was constant every time he visited, because God did he visit a lot. But Koizumi always justified it by marketing himself as just a reasonable guy who just wanted to honor the war dead. He just wanted to honor people who are dead. What's wrong with that? He protested that he intended simply to pray for the souls of the dead and reaffirm his commitment to peace. But his statement that the peace and prosperity we the Japanese enjoy today was built on the sacrifice of the war dead rankled, since it implied that the Japanese dead were national heroes instead of members of a brutal force engaged in war crimes. And by the way, what sense does that make? I get it if you believe in the US that, our soldiers died to protect our rights, because yeah, we've seen that we kind of won World War II and we've been pushed this propaganda for so long about the functions our military holds and really how important it is for us economically. But the whole reason that you have a functioning economy in Japan was because of the military disbandment and the takeover of the US and Japan. The rest of the world literally had to tell you stop fighting in wars against other places. And that's the only reason that you have all of what Japan has today. So what kind of sense does it make to say that the Japanese enjoy prosperity because of the war dead? It is the opposite. Koizumi was playing a simple game, okay? He would create, in substance, a Japan as weak to the US as ever. That way, Japanese capital would be satisfied. But in style, he would make it look like he was just the most patriotic, sympathetic nationalist that the office has ever seen. This was a tool that the LDP always had in its back pocket, especially since the US eradicated Japan's left wing and maintained institutions, namely the emperor and establishments like Yasukuni, which kept alive the traditions and ideals core to the Empire of Japan, which just encouraged more and more right-wing reactionary nationalist sentiment. This was part of the plan. This was part of the American plan. The more Japanese economy struggled to prosper in the late 20th, early 21st century, the more that Japanese nationalism took power. Now, eventually, Koizumi got his ass handed to him by the Japanese media. In July 2006, text from an interview of Emperor Hirohito in the 80s revealed that he himself, the Emperor of Japan, who was emperor during World War II, emperor of the Empire of Japan, had ceased visiting Yasukuni because it had enshrined A-class war criminals in 1978. Public sentiment was completely against Koizumi doing this at this point, and he kept doing it anyway. At one point, he even pettily referred to Hirohito as that person in a press conference. Can you imagine the balls, the gall of this guy? I am more pro-empire than the emperor. This is where Japanese politicians went. Shinzo Abe, his successor, visited Yasukuni as well, mostly before and after his terms as prime minister. Although one visit in 2013, during the anniversary of his second term in office, he went to the shrine and also put out a statement saying, "I'm just honoring the war dead, and not at all trying to offend the people that the war dead killed. Teehee." China fired back, calling it an effort to glorify the Japanese militaristic history of external invasion and colonial rule. Yasukuni, of course, was not the only tool that Japanese politicians could use to do this.
What's up, Dochi?
Were none of you gonna tell me that my hair looked like that? You might know that Japan has issues when it comes to admitting its war crimes. The context of this is a political campaign that has gradually gained steam since the 1980s. And to talk about this, I'd like to talk about a historian called Ikuhiko Hata. Ikuhiko Hata is a famed, controversial Japanese historian who wrote a book called The Nanjing Incident in 1986. Essentially, as the title implies, the book is an extensive study of numerous sources about the Nanjing Massacre. The book sought to take a centrist position, not at all siding with the people who were outright denying the massacre happened. There have been historians that have done that, while also opining that the figure of 300,000 dead is exaggerated. As history professor Takashi Yoshida put it in a 2006 book, although he acknowledged that wholesale atrocities had taken place in Nanjing, he disagreed with other members of the research committee regarding the death toll, concluding that between 38,000 and 42,000 civilians and surrendered soldiers were the victims of the atrocities. Unlike other calculations, his estimate excluded Chinese soldiers killed in action from the head count. Generally, the reaction to this book has been positive, but people do agree that the death count is a bit low. One person who held that position was the journalist Iris Chang. Iris Chang was a Taiwanese American writer and activist who focused on Chinese historical issues. Chang even confronted Hata about this in a press conference in 1997. At that time, she was going to release her soon-to-be very famous book, The Rape of Nanking, which promotes a death toll of over 300,000. On a 1998 NewsHour, she explained the importance of the number to David Gergen. 300,000, please keep in mind, is more than the death toll at Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. Chang's book reignited attention towards the barbarity of this massacre to an international audience, particularly in the US. There are very harrowing descriptions of what Japanese soldiers did. Grotesque stuff during the Nanjing Massacre. The book is a bit controversial. In its introduction, Chang writes that during the Nanjing Massacre, Japanese soldiers began an orgy of cruelty, seldom if ever matched in world history. You're going to notice something about her rhetoric here, between that interview where she compared it to the atomic bombs and said that the death was wider.
300,000 deaths is greater than the deaths from Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined.
To saying that the Nanjing Massacre had never been matched in world history, potentially, and the subtitle of the book, branding the massacre the forgotten Holocaust of World War II. There is a not-so-subtle undertone here about comparing tragedies happening to Chinese people to other ones that have been potentially more recognized, which were done to other people. Moreover, some of its details have been contested. This is something I don't want to get too deep into because it's a lot. But essentially stuff from the spelling of names to whether or not pictures actually indicated what Chang presents that they indicate, these things are debated, let's say. You can read about all of this in Takashi Yoshida's book, The Making of the Rape of Nanking. In that book, Yoshida chronicles how Chang's book potentially contains numerous errors and potentially problematic rhetoric, but how it also became fodder for nationalist denialism, who could point out often small errors that were made in that book and say, see, it's a lie, this never really happened. He also noted that the popularity of this book and the shitstorm that brewed afterwards paved the way for renewed scholarship in academy about this massacre. Now, whether the Rape of Nanking is a perfectly accurate historical book or not, whether the death toll is correct or not, and whether its rhetoric attempting to scale this event or compare it to other tragedies is appropriate or not, Chang's essential claims regarding the lack of accountability and transparency from the Japanese government since World War II are based in reality.
Don't forget some Japanese right-wingers shot, I think, the mayor of Nagasaki in the back simply because he said that he thought Hirohito had some responsibility for the war.
That was in 1989.
That's right.
As the 20th century came to a close and the economy started to change, the LDP became increasingly cozy with ultra-nationalist denialism of Imperial Japan's atrocities, and perhaps more importantly, its motivations. This is from a section of Chang's book. In September 1986, Fujio Masayuki, the Japanese Minister of Education, sabotaged his career when he declared that the rape of Nanking was just a part of war. In an interview with Bunge Shunju magazine, Fujio defended the actions of the Japanese during the Nanking massacre and claimed that the number of dead had been exaggerated. He also said that Korea was partly to blame for its annexation by Japan in 1910, that Korea willingly accepted colonization, and that the Tokyo war crimes trial was racial revenge meant to rob Japan of her power. Though Fujio made these comments only to restore the Japanese spirit through history and tradition, they cost him his job. That month, Japanese Prime Minister Nakasone Yasuhiro dismissed him from his post. And yes, that at the time would cost you your job, saying that as a Japanese politician, especially doing so in such a crass way. But this did not exactly make Japanese government go further left on this issue. Okuno Seisuke, who had been the prefectural director of the notorious Kempeitai, the secret Japanese military police during the war, rose after the war to become the Japanese Minister of Justice and even the Minister of Education. By 1988, Okuno had become the Japanese Land Agency chief and the third most senior member of the cabinet. But Okuno's undoing came that spring when he visited the Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo, it's always that place, and revealed his true attitudes about World War II. There was no intention of aggression, Okuno told reporters. The white race made Asia into a colony, but only Japan has been blamed. Who was the aggressor country? It was the white race. I don't see why Japanese are called militarists and aggressors. His statements provoked an uproar across Asia, prompting Okuno to adjust his wording. I didn't say Japan wasn't an aggressor. I said it wasn't the only aggressor. By May, Okuno had been forced to resign, but he remained unrepentant to the end. He had stepped down, Okuno said, only under pressure from the government, not because he wished to retract his statements. To me, these are the kinds of things that happen when there's not a proper effort to eradicate the institutions responsible for a country's wrongdoings. And that was the direct result of US intervention. It was the US's choice to keep the emperor intact. It was the US's choice to prop up a right-wing party as the one party of Japan. Not only did the emperor and torture scientists get off scot-free, but numerous power players in the Empire of Japan's military and civil government not only stayed active in politics, but became key figures. I hate to compare, but it's as apt as you can get in terms of time period. Imagine if leaders of the Gestapo ended up becoming key security ministers in Germany in the 80s. In fact, Nobusuke Kishi, the prime minister who pushed through the Anpo Treaty in the US in 1960, was a key Ministry of Commerce figure in Manchukuo decades prior, where Japan was exploiting Chinese slave labor, some commerce, and perhaps the central figure of 21st century Japanese politics was his grandson, the Prime Minister Shinzo Abe.
Oh no, that's an entrance.
To talk about Shinzo Abe, let's read from a piece interviewing historian Alexis Dudden, which is called Shinzo Abe Sought to Rewrite Japanese History. It's from The New Yorker. As Dudden says, Abe published several articles and books, and he gave numerous speeches about history and about his vision of Japan's history in particular. When he first became a parliamentarian in the early 1990s, inheriting his father's seat, he was part of a study group inside Parliament that is believed to have written a document denying the Nanjing massacre. The article used to be available in Japan's Diet archives. It is no longer traceable, but it was there. Abe was a central figure in the Japanese political movements to push ultra-nationalist narratives about the empire, especially during that time when The Rape of Nanking was becoming a popular book, and also when the Japanese government sought to finally provide redress for war crimes against comfort women. Dudden says Abe argued this in different places, that much of it was a fabrication, that much of it was an effort by China to smear Japan, that in fact nowhere near the numbers of people as claimed had been massacred, and that in many cases it was the Chinese soldiers targeting the Japanese. Dudden notes the rise of Nippon Kaigi in the 90s, which is an ultra-nationalist lobbying group that championed Abe and helped him become prime minister. In particular, in 2012, when Abe was back in power as prime minister, his study group opened a cabinet-level investigation into what's called the Kono Statement. That was the LDP's statement after years of denying that comfort women were taken against their will, apologizing after findings showed that, in fact, they were forced into prostitution. As Dudden says, that really touched off a more public debate among Japanese academics, Korean academics, Chinese academics, and all of their supporters, but most importantly, the victims, saying, wait a minute, is Japan going to rescind the apologies it's already made? Then, Dudden says, in the 2010s, we see a government-backed effort to pressure publishers into removing passages about atrocities committed by the Japanese army and Japanese soldiers during World War II, particularly on the continent in Asia, and also how Japanese efforts should be remembered at the archival level, how Japan's efforts against the Allies should be taught, and how battles that were lost should be thought about, for example. When Abe gave a speech to US Congress in 2015, he recalled largely battles from World War II that were ones Japan won or were considered a draw. Americans recognized that this was what he was talking about, says Dudden. And then Dudden says in August of that year, Abe talked about how Japan's efforts in 1904 and 1905, when Japan defeated Russia in the Russo-Japanese War, gave hope to oppressed people throughout the world. Well, this was the war that led to the colonization of Korea. So the speech was a direct slap to Korea. Dudden finally says Abe was very clear that much of his effort was to exonerate the name of his grandfather, who had been labeled a Class A war criminal. And Abe wrote in his book about, as a child, being teased because other kids his age were taunting him for his grandfather. So he really saw it as his mission, his destiny, to exonerate the family name and therefore to overturn this notion of criminality, that at the War Crimes Tribunal, Japan should not have been found guilty as charged. As you can see, the comfort women was the issue that nationalism and denialism truly charged and truly made rife with problems, let's say. Do you remember Ikuhiko Hata? I mentioned him at the start of this part. He became more and more gradually subservient to right-wing historical narratives. He would criticize them at points, and he would still engage in some really interesting historical work, but he would also work with the Abe government about addressing the comfort women issue. In a passage from The Comfort Women, Cicero So notes that Ikuhiko Hata used to have 90,000 as the number of comfort women that were taken in World War II. Later on, he changed this number to 20,000. Now, why would he do that? When the first number came out, his earlier work on it in 1993, the Korean comfort women movement, So writes, had just begun. Afterwards, after the Japanese pushback against this number and against the concept of the comfort women as forced prostitutes, things changed. His tune changed. Before I end this section and move on to the conclusion, it's only right that I once again talk about Iris Chang, who died by suicide in 2004 at the age of 36. She was, of course, the author of The Rape of Nanking, and a piece for Stuff magazine talks about her sort of journey and how her mental health deteriorated over time. At one point, it describes how Chang, when younger, had heard stories about the massacre at Nanjing, but when she saw about it as an adult, she said, "Nothing prepared me for these pictures. Stark black and white images of decapitated heads, bellies ripped open, and nude women forced by their rapists into various pornographic poses." She was working on another book, and apparently she was worried about the magnitude of it. It was to be about the Bataan Death March of 1942, when 90,000 American and Filipino soldiers had been brutalized by their captors, the Japanese army. In 1998, in an email exchange, Chang had told a CBS news broadcaster in Seoul, Victor Fick, "Not a single week goes by when I don't suffer harassment from some vicious right-wing Japanese group." And years later, working on this new book about the Bataan Death March, she said to her friend, "People in high places are not going to like it. Frankly, Paula, I fear for my life." You might know about the presence that Japanese nationalists have online when it comes to any historical discourse about Japan. They'll find you on Twitter. They'll find you. Like any dedicated group of reactionaries, Japanese nationalists harass people online, send them tons and tons of replies with things taken out of context and snapshots of articles, demanding people apologize, etc., etc. They'll bump heads with anyone and anything about this, to put it mildly. That even includes artists like the Korean group BTS, or particularly their fans, because there was a small controversy in 2018 about a writer for one of their Japanese songs. They mostly target people in Japan and other people in East Asia, but if they find you, they find you. You know, reactionaries tend to have these online groups that like to harass people. It's a thing. Sometimes they target anime. They target anime creators. For example, they gave some shtick to Hayao Miyazaki in 2013 when he put out the movie The Wind Rises. This film is basically a tribute to a wartime airplane designer. It's kind of one of those things you can take either way. It's not my favorite because it's pacifist in a sense, but it also kind of glorifies a lot of that work that was being done by the military. Japanese nationalists didn't like it. Apparently, according to The Guardian, they took to online forums to denounce Miyazaki, a former trade union official with well-documented left-wing leanings, as a traitor and anti-Japanese for the film's focus on the futility of war. There was also an issue where Miyazaki was bumping heads with the Abe administration in terms of making comments publicly saying that he was against constitutional reform. He was among the people that didn't really like the direction that nationalism was going in Japan, and had very much suffered from the last time that was becoming popular. I think all this does speak to the reality of Japanese media internationally, though. It's not just a propaganda machine. It's filled with artists who have all types of different meanings, all different educations, or different levels of engagement with political subjects. A lot of the stuff that becomes popular does not directly engage with politics very much. It's pretty similar to here. Sometimes stuff is endorsed by the government, sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's done covertly, sometimes not so much. So why do we see Japanese artists so different? Why is it that when it comes to all this, to discourse about Japan and nationalism and its legacy, that we go back to anime and we go back to toys and we say these things, they programmed us, they made us feel a way about Japan? Why are we so obsessed with and suspicious of the coolness of Japan? Okay, I've taken you on a bit of a wild and winding road here, but I think this video has been able to answer some questions to a satisfying degree. As far as why Americans and Westerners in general may not know a lot about what Japan did, it's hard to draw a sweeping conclusion, but we do know that the US has built up post-World War II as an ally that serves US interests. And so that has a lot to do with why we're not seeing news stories about Japan's history or about its current issues. Other than like, birth rates low, what's going on in Japan? But that's not really much. Then again, stuff like Unit 731 and the Nanjing Massacre have been covered in some popular media here over the past 30 years. But because we don't get the context of what happened, of who was in charge and why, it might be natural for people to respond, oh God, Japanese people are sick, what's wrong with them? And that doesn't get us any closer to a real education. This isn't about pseudoscientific ideas of race or ancient feuds that are just way above our heads. The story of modern Japan is a story of imperialism. It's about countries taking other countries' resources to feed exploitative economies. And you'll find that that's the case with just about any other country's political history or economic history or even cultural history to a degree over the past 300 years or so. Now, as far as whether Japan got away with war crimes, some people very much did. Like the emperor, like Shiro Ishii, like Nobusuke Kishi, because it served US interests for these people to not only get put away, but to remain in power. And because the people who ran Japan preferred this deal over socialism or something awful like that. But as far as our views on Japanese media and why we only view Japanese people through that, I don't know if there can be a conclusive answer other than because that's how we engage with other people. We see movies, TV shows, books, recipes, manufacturers. These things are relevant to our day-to-day lives. And especially in the case of art, I think it's a great way to start learning about other countries. Art is what shows us other people's perspectives. It gives us slices of their lives and histories. Yes, even if it is one piece. Art gives us the opportunity to relate to each other on a human level. Now, the reason we watch anime and use it to project very dumb ideas of Japan afterwards is because other systems in our lives do a poor job of contextualizing the world for us. In that way, it's not about art at all, is it? It's about our education systems that don't teach us about Japanese relations with the rest of Asia, or who runs Japan and why. It's about our media systems that only show us the perspectives their owners want us to see, ones that are favorable to the political establishment and whatever makes them money. Art itself is not to blame for our ignorance. Anime is not to blame for our ignorance. It is our education systems and media systems that we think Japan is some foreign place with unique abilities that most of us in the West don't understand. We are told in our media the secrets of extraordinary Japanese quality, like it's not just artisanship. We are told the Japanese have a secret method of managing harmoniously and efficiently, like it's not just work benefits and the conditions of a rapidly developing country. We're not being fooled into misunderstanding Japan by cartoons that are secretly propaganda and toys that are secretly propaganda and video games and gaming consoles and streetwear trends that are secretly propaganda. We don't need any help from Japan to misunderstand it. We do that very well all by ourselves.
To know life in every breath, every cup of tea, every life we take, the way of the warrior. That is Bushido.
There are two ways to prove my point. The first is this video, in which I have dug into historical scholarship of modern Japan, albeit modestly and surely with errors, and found that Japan is ultimately, like many other countries around the world, a client state of the United States. Not that complicated. Its imperial era was kickstarted by US imperialism, and it was US imperialism that reaped the profits of the Empire of Japan. Don't believe me? It was the Empire of Japan that secured Okinawa Island and made Okinawa Prefecture, which is now where the US stations so many of its bases for military purposes. The Empire of Japan developed massive industrial infrastructure to support its military, and then when the US took it over, it mobilized that infrastructure to use for its own military and its own economy, to fight against the Soviet Union in Korea and to exploit Japanese and American workers for decades. The Japanese Constitution is still sometimes called the MacArthur Constitution because it was made at the behest of Douglas MacArthur, who was basically the manager of Japan because we wanted him to be. I say we like I was in it. It wasn't my choice, guys. I just want to be clear. It was the US that kept the emperor in place, that let many of Japan's war criminals off the hook, and that put in place a conservative political party. And when Japan's economy eventually ran out of steam due to the limits of American buyers, those politicians denied Japanese wrongdoing more and more so that they could portray themselves as pro-Japan while continuously opening Japan up to American capitalists. There is practically no part of Japan's legacy in the West that doesn't emerge from American imperialism itself. Hell, it was Western cartoons that inspired the anime style. Simultaneously, anime is actually one of the easiest ways you can find out that Japanese people criticize their own country, which is what makes it really confusing when Moon Channel's video, Kawaii, Anime, Propaganda, and Soft Power Politics, claims basically that anime is just part of Japan's soft power machine. So here's the part you may have skipped to in the intro. This is the part where I criticize another YouTuber for their popular video. The truth is, though, this has actually been deployed to get you to watch a video called A Critical Response to Kawaii, Anime, Propaganda, and Soft Power Politics by the small channel Study of Swords. That video breaks down the tenuousness of Moon Channel's conclusions, mainly about the impact of Momotaro films and wartime propaganda on anime history. Interestingly, Study of Swords also breaks down the overt intentions of the Japanese government to deploy Japanese cultural products as a form of soft power, namely in the Cool Japan movement that was put forth by the LDP in the 2010s to brand Japanese products with the uniqueness of Japanese culture. Yes, folks, I am finally mentioning the Cool Japan initiative this deep into my video about Cool Japan. Well, titled Cool Japan. The reason it took this long to bring it up is because it's kind of irrelevant. Study of Swords pointed out that the Cool Japan strategy, which was put forth with a large fund, was basically a failure by 2017. You'll also note how this initiative began in the 2010s, long after the rise of Hello Kitty and Pokemon. Any attempt to link the interest to Japanese culture on the Cool Japan initiative is dead on arrival. It seems more an effort by the LDP to try to take advantage of the cultural crossover that certain products from Japan's culture industries have had in the United States and the rest of the world, which kind of makes sense, except it wasn't really about that. It wasn't really government spending that made these things powerful or popular, and Moon Channel acknowledges this to some degree. I think the failure of this initiative, though, speaks to how poorly Japanese propaganda actually roots itself in anime and other cultural industries, which are usually depoliticized, and if not, often in the works of left-leaning pacifist creatives, not only like Hayao Miyazaki, but like Astro Boy creator Osamu Tezuka, who Moon Channel mistakenly depicts as something of a wartime propagandist himself because of how much he admired Momotaro wartime films. Which is kind of like saying, Brian De Palma and other American directors are basically kind of pushing Russian propaganda because they were really inspired by Battleship Potemkin. Ultimately, this video shouldn't be totally bashed, as I do think its central message, which is that you should be critical of the media you watch, is important. I also think some of the historical claims of this video kind of map onto this one pretty well, although not all of it for sure. I would have to address my issues with its historical claims in a separate piece of content. Mainly, though, I'm concerned about the lack of on-screen in-text citation and the sloppiness of the bibliography, to be honest. The main problem, though, is the conclusion that it draws about Japanese media's impact, which seem to be based on just like ranting about annoying Japanophiles online. I get it. It's annoying that there are some people who think anything Japanese is cool and romanticize Japan as some quaint, beautiful utopia. But that does not mean, in fact, that Japanese media industries are basically propaganda. It's easy to see all of Japan's culture as being part of a unified Japanese essence. But Japan is not a person. Japan is a place with histories and conditions that people in it absorb, reject, and adapt to. Its art emerges from artisanal traditions, spiritual ideals, and international influences, just like ours. Think about Shinto, for instance. The idea of Shinto being some national, unified Japanese spiritual practice only emerged during the Meiji period because they needed to come up with a state religion. And a lot of what was practiced in Shinto before that was scattered different traditions that had some unifying themes, which often crossed over with Buddhism, which was an import from Nepal, technically. Narratives about Japan being some central nation with agendas not only falls for nationalist ideas, but in fact falls for something far older and more obviously insipid, something we'd like to think we just totally got rid of in Western society. It is the belief of Japan as duplicitous, as a spirit that tantalizes us with pretty colors and cool clothes, and it covers up a deep-seated motive to take all of our souls and leave us naked. It's Orientalism. And this brings us to my second point. Long before nationalism, long before the Industrial Revolution put us in factories or battlegrounds and king-made business owners around the globe with enough guile to exploit pieces of land and people atop them, people still viewed Japan the same way. They exoticized it. Moon Channel talks about this a bit in the video, in his early part, noting how Japonism and other fetishizations or romanticizations of Japanese culture emerged in the early modern West. Ultimately, though, Moon Channel doesn't really contextualize the Orientalism very well. He erroneously and idealistically conceives of the Empire of Japan and the outbreak of World War II as the outgrowth of a split in the West between romanticizing Japan as cute and quaint and hating Japan because it's barbaric. First of all, those two things, like any good Orientalism, are part of the same thing. It's just viewing a nation as exotic and different. That said, bro, we went to war with Japan. Not because it was subverting our desire to keep it cute and placid, but because it was interfering with our business in the Pacific. And because controlling Japan would become a boon for said business, especially for stomping out communism. The biggest problem with Moon Channel's video, though, and I'm not the first to point this out, judging by his comment section, is his claim that Japan is the #1 exporter of soft power in the world.
But there is no country, no culture on Earth that has succeeded in this very intentional development of soft power in quite the way that Japan has.
Without getting into a debate about what soft power actually is, this doesn't make any sense. If soft power is the power of your culture and its presence in other countries, the US wins this by far and away. The US's soft power is so powerful it's ubiquitous. It is hard to detect because it's so many layers of it underneath other countries' cultures. Hey, this is a note from Future Elliot. I'm aware that what Moon Channel is saying here isn't exactly the same as saying Japan is #1 at soft power, as some of the comments purport, but to me it still doesn't quite add up. Because at the very least it downplays just how intentionally, note my use of the word intentionally, I use it very intentionally, the US imposed media, fashion, language, and more on the rest of the world, especially the colonized. Eurovision. US soft power. Where do you think techno comes from? Dance music. Where do you think all these different forms of pop music come from? Hip hop. US soft power, in a way. What? Hey, this is Elliot from the future again. I want to note here also that techno and hip-hop and other pop music forms come from exploited Black American communities who are oppressed by systemic racism. Their artistic expressions are commodified by white American-owned industries and exported as soft power thusly. Do not get it twisted. Hip-hop and all Black music are still at their core an expression of the oppressed, just as Afrobeats is in Nigeria and corridos are in Mexico.
Ah, Los Angeles. Truly the greatest city in these United States of America. Something about this seems off. Eat your hamburgers, Apollo.
US soft power is even fundamental to the cultural products that Japan exports. Anne Allison, in her book Millennial Monsters, notes how the rise of Japanese toys emerges explicitly from the need to export to the US, and thus through cultural elements that were tailored to US audiences. Japanese cultural industries, much like other parts of Japanese industry, emerge from the needs of Japanese businesses to export to us, Americans. Yay. And considering how hard Japan's economic interests are chained to US economic interests, you begin to realize Japanese soft power is basically just US soft power in a ninja outfit. As American media heralded the rise of Japan's cultural output and Pokemon hegemon, Japan was cutting deals to be as dominated by US capital as ever, as its president kept hailing Elvis. This shit is a two-way street, it comes from the same place. I blame people's inability to see how interconnected our issues are around the world, whether in Japan or Palestine or in the US or Congo, with the specter of nationalism. It's ultimately the view that each country acts as one entity, one culture, one polity, that holds us back from seeing exactly whose interests prevail, where, and how. The idea of cool Japan, in my view, is not what gets viewers to consume Japanese art. It's the worldviews and the influences of the artists who created it reflected in the art that resonates with people. Japanese people have borne the brunt of colonial violence, and so many of them make art that responds to that in ways that resonate with people around the world who also know that violence well. Japanese people have dealt with generations of sexist conventions, with the derangement of militarism. Japanese people often have ancestral connections to their land and concerns about what is being done to it by rich people, based in centuries of observations. Doesn't that sound familiar? It should. So many of us around the world also feel those things. Around the world, we love creative expressions of childhood innocence. We love colorful and soft depictions of nature. We hate war. We see ourselves in anime protagonists trying to make the best of themselves under terrible circumstances. We see the value of human connection in these characters as deep, romantic, and platonic bonds. We can only engage with what's put in front of us. The veneration of a recent concept of centralized Japanese culture, a unified Japanese race, and internationally distributed, well-budgeted Japanese products are all the products of imperialism. The sooner you can put to rest the idea of nations as peoples, as races with unified missions and unified goals, and the sooner you can recognize the internal contradictions, the conflicting interests, the groups, the traditions, the industries within every country, the sooner you can recognize that coolness is arbitrary. What we truly find cool, despite everything, is human connection. And human connection is nationless. Thanks for watching. On Patreon, I will be releasing the uncensored version of this, as well as some additional clips of stuff that I thought about putting in the video but left out throughout the week. We also upload onto there previews of upcoming videos, as well as interviews with great creators like Tara Mooney and FD Signifier and Noah Samson, Zoe B, Babilla, Alice Capel, Lily Alexander. How many people do I gotta name? So please subscribe to the Patreon. Thanks to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. And goodbye. Should I say sayonara? Okay, that's it.
See you, Space Cowboy.